If all laws were repealed today, would you go around robbing and hurting other people?
Absolutely not.
Okay. You would
No.
not. Okay.
No.
No.
You would not.
Nope.
Okay.
Oof. Sounds tempting, but no. I think I would do the morally upright thing.
Okay. And how about you?
Nah, I wouldn't.
You would not. Okay.
Not a chance.
Okay. So you're not the reason that we need laws. Okay.
I don't think so.
You don't think so? And how about you?
No.
That's no.
Okay. All right.
It's just not moral.
So how do you think the famous tyrants in history managed to get millions of people to follow them? How do you think that happened? One person, millions of people doing whatever they say.
Probably like money and charisma. That's probably what I would say.
Yeah.
Cult of personality.
They use their power to oppress people, to make them feel like they didn't have any power, and that way they felt like they needed the king to survive.
By being cruel, by killing, by using
Fear.
people as fear, as
Using
an example.
people's fear.
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 Having an army or something, yeah.
I'm not sure actually. Probably through fear,
Okay.
maybe.
Power.
Money.
Okay.
Power. They had power over the people by their little minions, which enforced the power.
Whoever you last voted for, did you fully trust and support them, or did you just distrust them less than the other person?
Distrusted less.
Okay.
Definitely.
Distrusted them less than the other person.
I think I mostly trusted him. Mostly.
You mostly
Not,
trusted him?
not all the way, but like by a large amount more than the other one.
Distrust them less than the other person.
I guess distrust more than the other, but
I think I mistrusted him less than the other person.
I agree.
I voted against somebody to vote for the one I voted for. Yes.
Okay.
Not voted for him, I voted against the other person.
I guess it was more like a lesser of two evils
Okay.
sort of deal for me.
Would you like it if you could choose for yourself which government programs, if any, you were going to pay for?
Yes.
Yeah.
Say yes, definitely.
Oh yeah, I would like that.
Okay.
I think, idealistically, yes, but I don't think, again, it's a matter of things actually working,
Sure.
and that you can't pick and choose.
Okay.
Absolutely.
If any. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'd like to know where my money is going.
Absolutely.
If they're taking my money and using it for programs, I would like to know exactly where my money's going.
No, that's not how it works. Just because I don't agree with something doesn't mean it shouldn't be covered or paid for. This is how this country runs. If we don't like the process, then we have to change the process. But the way it is now, that's how it is.
Would you take this deal? You never have to pay any kind of tax, income tax, property tax, sales tax, etc., but you're not allowed to vote for anyone else to be taxed either.
I think that would. I mean, if it's like in the like a very general sense, then yeah, I would agree to that.
Yeah.
Yep. Sure would. I don't think we should be taxed. No.
I agree. Absolutely.
Absolutely not.
Okay. So you would not take that deal?
No.
Yeah.
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 that's okay.
Hello and welcome to Health Revealed Part 6. Welcome for joining us, and thank you for joining us. And for anybody who's been sharing this seminar so far, just with us recording this seminar, we've already gotten great feedback from folks. So thank you for everybody out there who has been sharing it, sharing your journey, your expertise as well with us. We greatly appreciate it. I'm here with Stephanie Mo Davis, Scott Gordon, and Leslie Powers. Say hello, everybody.
Hello.
Great. So let's continue here talking about this idea of conviviality versus institutionalization, right? This is an idea because we got to move forward. What's our mindset going to be like? How are we going to be the visionaries? Perhaps we need to use a little bit of creativity. We talked about last time a lot of new ideas in case you were here and you listened to, amazing perspectives about the schooling models and the models we're currently using in healthcare and in government and society, and also on an individual level. So here's a new term that we have to introduce here from Ivan Illich, right, which you might have heard of before. I actually had somebody refer to me and say, hey, you got to check out his work because it deals a lot with what we talk about. Here's a quote. It says, I choose the term conviviality to designate the contrary of institutionalized productivity. I want it to mean autonomous and creative intercourse among persons, an intercourse of persons with their environment, And this is in contrast with the conditioned response of persons to the demands made upon them by others or their milieu. I consider conviviality individual freedom realized in mutual personal interdependence and, as such, an intrinsic ethical value. I believe that without conviviality, life becomes meaningless and persons wither. Now, he also mentions directly this idea that we introduced last time called anarchy, right? Which we did not want to fear because we have some psychologists talking about this idea, and we just found that quite profound. It's like here you have a bunch of people talking about freedom in a sense that of anarchy, which in a sense that we don't usually hear. And it's very interesting because, we talked about last time this idea of like personal anarchy, external, internal, different forms, this idea of voluntarism as an alternative way of looking at it. But really the term, as Scott mentioned last time, just means without rulers, not without rules, which helps us kind of understand the perspective being shared here. It mentions anarchists can suffer from that malaise predicted by Illich, which comes from individualistic and radically unequal ways of living. And so their writing can become cynical, tired, and resentful, right? There can be issues among the rebel or the person who's the outcast where they fall into that and they become overly cynical. We have to recognize there can be problems that then can drag, right, on that person who is really waking up. There's a lot of symptoms. We'll get into that as well. This idea of the conspiracy theorist that is created in environments where these people are merely questioning the status quo. And it says, as Nietzsche noted many years ago, anarchists are prone to the latter, like Newman, who engages with this criticism. My interest is in an anarchism without resentment, right? So an anarchism that does not have an emotional bias, you may say. Really looking at perhaps, can we get together in a free world? Can we work together equally in freedom without necessarily, having like, oh my gosh, hierarchy and the patriarchy and domination and authority, and getting very emotional about it, but looking at it perhaps under a psychological point of view, something that Newman and Illich and some of these folks are very outspoken about.
Yeah, I want to simplify this idea to the meaning of it, of being friendly, right? So by definition, conviviality means to be friendly and lively, to use friendliness. And so I see this as a kind of an old-fashioned value, it seems, in today's society of just using your manners and being kind, having compassion, being curious, seeing other people as equals and having good manners as you interact, right? And there's so much ground we can make if we take this attribute on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can people have views without, getting violent with those views? I would say it would be counterintuitive for somebody who's against violence to then start using violence, right?
It's like social skills 101 here, and unfortunately, especially with the online world we're in, that isn't often being prioritized.
Here's a quote from Eckhart Tolle, or Tolle. We were talking about how to pronounce his name. We hear from different folks. The quote here, the ego is destined to dissolve in all its ossified structures, whether they be religious or other institutions, corporations, or governments, will disintegrate from within, no matter how deeply entrenched they appear to be. Now, remember, last time we talked about this idea of this personal or internal anarchy, or that the government is inside of people. Not necessarily this external thing that we attack and say this is the problem, but rather there's this belief system, the state doctrine that Carl Jung calls it, this statism that we are detailing as a whole. It's a belief system. It takes place within our minds, within ourselves. So isn't that interesting? An ego dissolve, right? Or an ego death. Well, we might relate this to the art of yoga. And Jamie Heckert on Michael Stone talks about this. Michael Stone is a psychotherapist. Quote, the essence of psychological change is waking up to a world that doesn't pivot around self-image. By definition, spirituality is waking up to something greater than the stories we tell about ourselves and others and the world. I've seen a lot of people who have done so much therapy, they can talk about their problems from a Freudian perspective, a Jungian perspective, a feminist perspective, and so on. But yet, even though they know about their problems, they still don't know how to let them go. They don't know how to work with them because what they are missing is the present experience. When a symptom arises in present experience, it's in present experience, it's not in the past. Yoga is suggesting several things. It is suggesting that the past is fictional. When you talk about your past, you're generating fiction that gives you a sense of self. But we don't see that as just a narrative or as just a story, a chapter in the great anthology that we call Me and Mine. We identify with our problems that serve to create a sense of self. Health or liberation or freedom from the yoga perspective is seeing through the mechanism in the mind that always superimposes a self on everything. It is not enough just to recognize the pattern of our thoughts. We have to see through the process of cognition so that we can see, however, how whatever we are noticing is impermanent and without an inherent eternal substantiality in time and space. And when we let go of all this contextualization and storytelling, the feeling that is left is intimacy with all things. What's extinguished is attachment to your viewpoint, and that's the heart of intimacy, that life is always organizing itself, and this is the anarchy of yoga. I found this to be an amazing point of view that encapsulates a lot of what we've been talking about regarding spiritual and religious experiences, of course, anarchy from this very different perspective. And then even, yoga, most people may think like just the exercise, but there's a philosophy behind it. Stephanie, maybe you can expand on this since you are a yoga teacher. Would you say you agree with some of these thoughts and what do you think about this?
Yeah, I agree with many of the thoughts stated here. It's complicated because most human beings really live essentially within our thoughts and our mind and our beliefs. And we have a tendency to want to control the external. And we feel that we're going to do that by how we think and act. And somehow we are imparting our will through our mind, per se, onto things in the external. And the thing with yoga is that it is connected to a slightly different realm, which doesn't necessarily mean better, but it does mean higher or broader than cognition or mentalization. And it's very difficult for somebody who is in the throes of the complexity of the mind to actually impart or couple a spiritual perspective with the mental perspective, because it almost sounds like a dichotomous opposite. And then because the mind's tendency is to want to control, where yoga asks to let go of identity and thought. There's a popular mantra that's neti neti, N-E-T-I, N-E-T-I, which means not this, not that. I am not this, I am not that. It's a constant and a reiterative de-identification with our story to connect us to the broader tapestry of life and every human that lives within it. I think yoga is a great practice because it not only helps the body, yoga essentially helps to stretch the tension from the fascia and the muscle tissues that can accumulate through our day-to-day activities. So it's a great somatic approach for people to release stress. But the mind-body connection through the breath and the coupling of the breath as a mindful meditation is essential. And it's what gets somebody in the present moment, and it starts to chip away at the mind's desire to constantly identify and repeat the stories. And when you stop repeating the same stories and you create room and space in your own soul and your brain and your spirit, something new can be birthed. But if you don't allow that space to quiet your mind and be in the present moment, you have no space for new things to be birthed. And you're essentially repeating your life over and over and over each day. Whereas a yogi would understand that each day is a complete fresh slate. So I think this is really beautiful. I think yoga is a very beneficial practice mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And but again, it takes a commitment because the mind always wants to drive the bus, right? There's that quote that says, mind is a great servant, but a terrible master. And I think that's part of our issues that humanity has to face is how do we understand what the ego is, why it's there, why it's trying to protect us, where is that coming from, and then to find a way to live in that space of grace with the transcendent reality of us all being connected on a much deeper transcendent level without using yoga to spiritually bypass the psychological. So I see this as a relationship between psychiatry and the transcendent, the spiritual. And there's that lifelong, that lifelong desire to merge science with spirituality. You hear this all the time. What I've recently discovered is that only when we merge our own science with our own spirituality, personally, individually, and understand this duality and this nature that we have, can we start to ask for a different reality externally where science appreciates the spiritual and the spiritual appreciates the science. We have to all understand that coupling within ourselves and this very, very different approaches to life and be able to be in a loving relationship and not a dualistic relationship with those within us.
Wow. Of course, we talked about before the problem with labeling, a disease or illness and making that diagnosis, and then the issue of the left brain, right, which wants to compartmentalize and rationalize everything. We also mentioned somatherapy as an example of using the body as a means to change the mind, right? So here you have another example. And of course, in health coaching, we have this idea of the beginner's mind, which is when you talk to a new client or new patient, you always go in with like, hey, I'm willing to learn from you. I'm going to ask you questions. I'm not going to go in with like a superimposed agenda. Like this is what I'm going to do. This is my expectation of you. No, I'm just going to listen and just ask high mileage questions, right? So there you go. Just different perspectives on it. Thank you, Stephanie. And so we can have a projection onto reality. He continues here. If we react to our projection onto reality based on memory rather than what is present, we are likely to reproduce the patterns of relation we hope to release. If we can see the world with insight, with fresh eyes, with a wakeful heart, then public acts have different effects. Changing perception changes action. If the state is always a state of fear, at once defensive in relation to other non-states and internally aggressive towards elements deemed to be dissident, dangerous, and different, in order to justify its role as protector, then to learn to see the world through the eyes of love is to cultivate an other state of mind. This right here is key, of course, because we're talking about statism, which creates the state. And it's a mindset that can be based, as we mentioned before, on fear, on compliance, on this belief in authority. And that authority is usually there justifying itself as, I'm going to protect your rights. You need me for your rights. If you can't have freedom unless you have me. And, the world would be dangerous without it. And so in order to have this protector role, you have to create this dichotomy, which we talked about before as well, which is like this problem react solution, perhaps, right? Well, here we have the art of somatics. Let's talk a bit more about somatics, shall we? We have Thomas Hanna, who coined this term somatics, and Thomas encourages readers to strive for a society where individuals can achieve their full potential and live authentically. He distinguishes between humanoids who live mechanically without deep feeling or compassion, and fully human beings who embrace their potential for conscious, compassionate living. He shares the idea that America has yet to realize fully that it's, as a society, can foster true human development and freedom over material success. He emphasizes the importance of cultivating an interior life, that is, self-reflection, emotional depth, to achieve genuine freedom and avoid the tyranny of mechanical existence. Of course, last time we also talked about the internet of bio-nano things, right? IOBNT, and how dangerous that can be potentially. And this is very mainstream knowledge of certain technology that exists nowadays that could be put into people's bodies that can change and alter functions and even, operate natural functions. And you would not even be able to tell that it's in control at times. Crazy what we can do. So, are we fully human, not just on a physical level, but a mental and spiritual level? These are the questions you have to ask.
Corey, I just want to bring up in regards to what you just said about potentially, having any sort of bioweapon. Many people I've come across have never been taught or have actively suppressed, either consciously or unconsciously, their feeling states. So how can you even discern or be able to detect if something nefarious has gone on if you don't even really understand your own feelings? So one thing about yoga and somatics is that it helps to truly attune you to your feelings more accurately. You're more attuned to your bodily sensations, which a lot of people I have come to understand, they don't know anything's wrong until, something serious happens. There's no ability to tap in to the subtle cues that the body has been sharing with that individual over an extended period of time. So, nowadays, staying connected to your feelings so you can discern when something is off sooner than later, I would feel would be pretty important.
Another thing, if you look on the picture on the screen, you see this lady holding one hand on her heart, one hand over her belly. Well, it's actually, this is a common breathing exercise. You can do this as well if you're listening. Being able to see if your breathing is coming from your lungs or from your stomach, what they call belly breathing. This is a very basic technique just to realize, some breathing that we were born with that maybe we, due to stress, do not persist with. And this type of breathing is very relaxed, very deep, whereas this breathing up in the lungs can be very fast-paced and not necessarily as slow and in touch. So she's really getting in touch here with her breath, which is perhaps one of the keys of meditation and breathing exercises. It's like, can you follow your breath? Can you notice your thoughts? And there we go. We can move forward from a clear mind.
I just want to add, Corey, if anybody's watching this and has considered taking up breath work or anything similar to this, is that just keep in mind the common phrase I heard having my yoga studios was, I don't practice meditation because I'm not good at it, or I don't like to sit still. It's not my thing. And I just want to mention to everybody here that I don't know too many people who say that it is their thing. It's a practice. And it's always uncomfortable when you first start to sit with yourself deeply, when you know that so many other things could be getting done, right? But it is that practice of cultivating the stillness, knowing that things are going to be okay, getting in tune with your body. But be patient because most people do not like it, especially in the beginning.
Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. For sure, for me, I can say I can testament to that. I definitely have been prone to overthinking in my past, and then getting into breathing and meditation, I was like, what is this? So for anybody out there thinking like that, I don't blame you. So let's talk about the military. We haven't touched on this that much. This is rather important. I've interviewed, and I mentioned this before, I've interviewed people who have been veterans, people part of the system, who have faced a lot of trauma. So this is a good example of people who face tremendous amounts of trauma, going to war, fighting people overseas. Here we have a quote from Augustine Hammond. During the investigation into psychology from the military, we found that any individual, the holder of power, has a tendency to abuse of that power. We have reported many cases pre-potency, all of which showed clues, violence, that characteristic of the profession. Now, of course, this is the way it's written, so I have it as the quote. But he's saying that all these different people that he looked at, he all saw clues of violence, which of course is the characteristic of war and military. Military training is designed to break down individual identity, critical thinking, and autonomy and rebuild it in line with military values. This includes rigorous physical training, drills, and rituals that reinforce discipline and absolute conformity, right? Soldiers are indoctrinated with a set of beliefs that prioritize loyalty to the military and the nation, often through propaganda and controlled information. The military environment fosters a strong group identity where soldiers see themselves primarily as part of a unit rather than as individuals. This can lead to increased dependence on the group. Hammond notes changes in behavior such as increased aggression, a heightened sense of duty, and a willingness to follow orders without question, right? Which can persist even after leaving the military, he says. The military often dehumanizes both its own soldiers and the enemy, viewing them as tools or targets rather than individuals. This dehumanization is necessary for soldiers to carry out violent acts without moral hesitation. Hammond questions the morality of a profession centered around violence and conflict, arguing that it perpetuates a cycle of violence and authoritarianism. How are we responding to the evils in this world, right? This really prompts that question. Is it creating this government that's the protector that's ending up harming so many people, democide is top cause of death, and then, war, which often creates these governments or used as a tool for these governments to maintain their power. What is going on here? Crazy stuff for sure. I think this is peak statism, if you ask me. The mindset of the soldier. I mean, the person who really is stay in line. You see them, they all look the same. They're all marching together. There's plenty of pictures online. And if you look at that, tell me, is that human? Does that look human to you? Doesn't look human to me. Well, many people will say, right, that this is just human nature. This is the way we're supposed to be, right? We are conflict animals, but I would say this this comes at quite a bit of a challenge when we start getting into morality and evolving humanity and consciousness and spirituality and a lot of the ideas we were mentioning, right? And the importance of education as we're doing right now. Well, what are the impacts of war? War often leads to increased authoritarianism within society as governments expand their powers under the guise of national security. This can include censorship, surveillance, and the suppression of dissent. This can lead to a permanent increase in government control even after the war ends. Soldiers frequently experience psychological trauma, including PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Hammond explores how the horrors of war leave lasting scars on the mental health of soldiers. Prolonged exposure to violence can desensitize soldiers, making them less empathetic and more prone to aggressive behavior. This desensitization can affect their interactions with civilians and family members, which we may commonly see. Civilians living in war zones or under the threat of war experience constant fear and anxiety. This is what they experience. This can lead to widespread psychological distress and a breakdown of social cohesion. War can both unite and divide communities. While some may rally together in a show of solidarity, others may become divided along lines of loyalty, ideology, and survival strategies. Right, so you have like this mixed truth going on. It's like, oh, well, it's bringing people together, it's rebooting the economy, but at what cost? And is that really what's going on? Militarism can become ingrained in cultural norms and values, right? How many TV shows, how many movies have been made about this, perpetuating a cycle of violence. This includes the glorification of military heroes, the normalization of military presence in everyday life, and the acceptance of war as a necessary evil. Right? This idea of a necessary evil, same justification many people give toward this government that people are attached to, this idea, right? So the defense industry and war profiteering play significant roles in sustaining militarism. Economic interests often divide the continuation of military conflicts, drive the continuation of military conflicts as war becomes a profitable enterprise for certain sectors. So there's also money behind this. It's not just a perpetuating cycle of, oh, this person did violence, I have to do violence to them back. It's like, oh, this is for the very government to exist in the first place, and it may even be because we want to make money, right? And we need to uphold the economy. We need to uphold our values and this ideology, and these people are bad. So What are the justifications, and how do people carry through with those justifications? What are those lasting impacts? We can relate this to this idea of madness and what Michael Foucault says is governmentality. Perhaps another way to say statism, right? There's so many ways to look at this mindset that takes place within individuals. Foucault traces the history of how society has treated mental illness. In the classical age, the mentally ill were confined alongside the criminals and the poor, reflecting society's desire to segregate those deemed abnormal. The rise of psychiatry transformed madness from a moral failing to a medical condition, giving psychiatrists the authority to define and treat mental illness. Foucault highlights the power dynamics between psychiatrists and patients, where the former exert control over the latter through diagnosis and treatment. We talked about those problems. The governmentality consists of biopolitics. This involves the regulation of populations through policies on health, hygiene, birth rates, and mortality. Pastoral power, borrowing from religious practices. He describes how modern states adopt a pastoral role, guiding and caring for the population while also exerting control, right? Carl Jung talked about that too. And then governmentality encompasses a range of techniques, including statistics, surveillance, and public health measures to monitor and regulate the behavior of individuals and populations. He emphasizes that knowledge is not neutral, but is intertwined with power. And he expands on this through discursive formations, which is that knowledge is produced through discourses, which are systems of thought composed of ideas, attitudes, and practices. These discourses shape what is considered true or false. And what you'll have is a regime of truth, right? A regime of truth. Different societies have different regimes of truth which determine what is accepted as knowledge. Those in power control these regimes, using them to maintain their authority. So you have institutional power. Institutions like schools, hospitals, and prisons produce and disseminate knowledge, reinforcing their power over individuals. I think this is a great summary of a lot of what we've also talked about with schools and integrating a lot of these institutions together and putting them all on this challenge here, saying what is really going on regarding this mentality, this statism that takes place within all these institutions. And are we really looking at how this history is merely repeating itself? And we're going based on this former history of how we segregated these people, and now we have this way of diagnosing and segregating people in a little slightly different way.
You know, I think there might be a third option or another after that, where psychiatry saw mental illness as madness. And I don't know if any of you have ever been in old like mental hospitals and seen the horrific kind of torture devices that were actually used. It was very real and very severe. But then turning that into a medical condition is still questionable. And I think, as we've brought up multiple times, perhaps it's more of a spiritual condition. And I think it's not wise to just settle in this idea of medicalizing all mental health or addiction problems. I think it's a very limiting lens.
Well, Dr. Michael Stone studied over 600 criminals and historic events, and he talks about, where's this idea of control come from? Where does it stem from ultimately? He says the desire for control is often rooted in deep-seated psychological needs, such as insecurity and a need for validation. A common tactic used by authoritarian figures is the dehumanization of their victims. I mean, this is just reaffirming some of the previous researchers we mentioned. By viewing others as less than human, they justify their cruel and violent actions. This dehumanization can be seen in historical examples, such as genocides and systemic oppression. Many authoritarian figures exhibit traits of narcissism, ASPD, which is antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy. And narcissism involves an inflated sense of self-importance and a lack of empathy, while psychopathy includes superficial charm, manipulativeness, and a lack of guilt or remorse. Authoritarian leaders often use ideology to justify their actions. This can include political, religious, or cultural beliefs that frame their violent actions as necessary or righteous. By appealing to a higher cause, they gain support and legitimacy for their actions. Reasons for this behavior include the bystander effect, social conformity, obedience to authority, moral disengagement, cognitive dissonance, and groupthink. Groupthink, doublethink, this is concepts we talked about before. Cognitive dissonance is you have this belief system, you're exposed to new information, you say, that can't be true, right? Bystander effect, I see harm being done, I don't step in to help the person that's being harmed. I let it happen. And this is very dangerous because this allows the authoritarianism to grow. And this still happens within today's day and age. If anybody's watching this and looking at these words and they're curious, you have to admit that this is happening right now in our world. This isn't something that just happens in authoritarian regimes, we would say, in history, like, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. These are conditions and symptoms and belief systems that happen right now, where people believe righteously in their ideology and that their ideology is better than other people's ideologies. Okay, and that other people, are justified violence upon them. And, we need to go to war and we need to go capture. People still have these mindsets, right? So just something to bear in mind. So what are the early warning signs then, right? What if we are on the road to more tyranny? If I'm saying we already exhibit some of those traits, and I gave some examples. Early exposure to physical, emotional, or sexual abuse can significantly impact psychological development. We talked about childhood being very important, leading to maladaptive behaviors and a propensity for violence. Insecure or disorganized attachment styles in childhood can result in difficulties forming healthy relationships and managing emotions, contributing to violent tendencies. The prefrontal cortex of the brain is responsible for executive functions such as decision making, impulse control, and moral reasoning. Abnormalities or damage to the prefrontal cortex can impair these functions, leading to increased aggression and poor judgment. And he goes into more about, certain parts of the brain and how it can cause issues regarding violent behavior and lack of control over your own impulses. He also mentions the MAOA gene, which is often referred to as the warrior gene, and it's been linked to aggressive behavior. Individuals with certain variants of this gene may be more prone to violence, especially if they have experienced childhood trauma. Stone envisions a future where early signs of violent tendencies in children can be addressed before they become entrenched, and where certain individuals can be rehabilitated and safely reintegrated into society. We mentioned last time, why is it that our children are not learning about, masculine and feminine and the brain structure? Why is it that we're not learning about trauma and the impacts of that on our health? I think that raises a big question here in line with what Stone envisions regarding, seeing these early warning signs before they become problematic. And usually this is the case, right? For all evil, evil exists, but will it grow? That is determined by the environment and by the people that is surrounded with that evil. Are they going to let it grow is the question.
We're talking about not only an individual brain and physiology impact, but we are talking about the impact of relational distress or dysfunctional or abusive relationships. So physical, emotional, sexual abuse is a relational injury that has deep effects on an individual's brain and body, right? So we're also talking about a relational problem that's epidemic in our society.
Well, when we're talking about history, and we've talked a bit about it before, giving many historical examples, by the way, of many of the points we've made, we can look at this idea of moral panics, which was coined by Stanley Cohen, a criminologist, sociologist, and there's basically 5 stages to a moral panic. So we have some charts here. First, an activity gains media attention, right? Then the agencies of control respond. Then deviance becomes amplified. And then an exaggeration, symbolization, and prediction takes place. And then the problem becomes redefined, and then the cycle continues. Okay, so I have different charts to show this. Okay, so we have different perspectives. So something or someone is defined as a threat to values or interests. The threat is then depicted in an easily recognizable form by the media. When there is a massive, rapid buildup of public concern, now you have all these people like looking at the media. Then there is a response from authorities or opinion makers, right? And then the panic recedes or results in social changes and new laws will be implemented. But this can then create the cycle again because not everybody's going to agree with the laws, these different social changes. And you're going to see, this happens a lot nowadays with always, new concerns coming to light and people saying, well, we got to change that. Here's another chart that I think describes it well in a bit more detail. And you can notice here, you have first the crime, as defined by crime control agencies. This is considered the deviant act. And then operation of news values, selective practices of news making, crime as news, selective portrayal of crime in the media, and then deviancy amplification, targeting of news, public concern, crime control on particular aspects of deviance, and then moral panic, law and order campaign. So this is very similar to what we mentioned before with the Hegelian dialectic of problem, reaction, solution. Here's a problem, oh my gosh, there's a big reaction. Now, here's the solution, right? The authorities come in. The authorities of the government, of the systems, they're expected to come into the picture. They don't need to be, but many people expect them to be. That's the first thing people look to often. So what politician, what law needs to be passed to change this thing that happened in society?
It also shows how powerful media can be in shaping public outcry and public health policy, and that it could very easily end up with misunderstandings about the actual truth or the root causes of situations, and that panic lead to over control at multiple levels,
And I just want to add upon what Leslie just said. When you have this public outcry, especially if it's not coming from an accurate place, you have emotional individuals coalescing with other emotional individuals, creating like a consecration of energy, and then the lawmakers, it's like they're addressing something that might not be accurate because this energy has consecrated or concretized around what appears to be a public issue.
Yeah, I could also see here it's like, the crime as defined by control agencies and the news, it's selective, right? And the laws are made by, some people too. And so there's going to be a lot of filtering through these steps, and some things may get lost in translation along the way. It's like it's like that common game of like pass this along and see what it ends up being by the end of the room, right? It's like if you have like 100 people in the room and you pass along a message, it changes by the 100th person. You're like, it's totally different from the beginning because words start to get mixed up and people start getting mixed up with what actually happened. And of course, what's considered a crime, right? Of course, we gave examples before of how madness and crazy people could be people who are normal. Like we looked at the witch trials, or we can look at, the Japanese internment camps, or, it's a crime if you don't obey us, just obedience. And as a whole, if you're not doing what is being said to be done, you may be considered a criminal. So, what is that deviant action? And does it justify this law and order campaign? Does any action justify a law and order campaign that is then imposed on everyone? Is it going to continue the cycle in many different ways? This I think just gives a general picture of how things manifest in our world based on the law systems we have.
And I'll just add the complication, the distortions that can come from private interest groups with lots of money that are, putting money on, giving money to politicians and so forth. How that can distort outcomes, and the truth, the actual needs for public health are lost amidst all of that.
Yep. Right away, you have the authority of the media and then the authority of the government jumping right into the picture. And so when you cut that authority, what happens here? Can people be more responsible of what goes on and more in control of their news sources, so that way it is more accurate and they can take further control of the situation? Maybe there's more transparency, right? These are the questions to ask. Well, what can happen, he expands on this, is the denial of evil. So literal denial, right? There's three different types of denial. And then there's interpretive denial, implicatory denial. So literal denial is when governments or state actors claim that the alleged human rights violations simply did not occur, when they actually did. A government might deny the existence of torture or disappearances despite evidence to the contrary. This form of denial is often the first line of defense when accusations arise. Then there's interpretive denial, where acts of torture might be rebranded as enhanced interrogation techniques, or civilian casualties in a conflict might be referred to as collateral damage. This stage involves a reframing of the narrative to make the actions seem more acceptable or less severe. And then implicatory denial, a government might admit to surveillance or detention without trial, but argue that these measures are essential to combat terrorism or maintain order. This stage involves moral and ethical justifications to mitigate the perceived wrongdoing. So again, what are those justifications? Well, he just gives specific examples. Here's three different types of justifications that can be made when it comes to denying evil, right? He expands on this more. He says the state's involvement in social control extends beyond law enforcement to include welfare agencies, educational systems, and public health initiatives. These institutions work together to create a comprehensive framework for managing deviance. Folk devils. These are individuals or groups who are portrayed as outsiders and blamed for societal problems. They become scapegoats for broader social anxieties. Well, moral panics, that chart we showed before, these are widespread fears that some evil threatens the well-being of society. Media, politicians, and other influential figures often amplify these fears. The media plays a crucial role in creating and sustaining moral panics by sensationalizing events and portraying folk devils in a negative light, right? So again, here's that one group to attack. Just like in military and war, here's the one group you go and attack. The response to moral panics often involves stricter laws, increased policing, and other measures that can lead to authoritarianism. Identified key psychological mechanisms: fear and anxiety, scapegoating, conformity and social pressure, moral outrage, authority and control, and media influence. In his book on prisons, he advocates humane treatment and the benefits of rehabilitation over punishment due to the long-term psychological effects many prisoners experience. So I figured to add that part in there at the end, because his work doesn't just, detail the governments, but also, the measures they do in the prison system and war. These are all often correlated. And they have similar effects on people because why? Maybe they're all based on this violence and this fear and this authority. And when you start to shift it away to love, a lot of those systems start to dissipate together as well. And maybe that's not a coincidence, but this is very interesting, and I want to hear, your thoughts on this as well. Because as we move into a world where people fear tyranny, maybe there are leading signs that help us understand how did we get there in the first place. And maybe it's through these panics. And we talked about before how there can be these mass psychosis, mass hysteria situations that lead to people becoming very desensitized and willing to put up with more and more evil until it grows so big that they start to then finally pay attention to it. But in the beginning stages, they don't notice it. And they become so conditioned to wanting more control that it becomes almost a sort of an addiction, we mentioned, right? And so very, very troublesome, because people will fall into something thinking it's right when it may be very well causing evil.
Corey, I just want to add, as you were talking on that slide, this may be a little bit of a reach, but it was reminding me a lot of the differences between paying attention to preventative medicine or waiting and being oblivious to things that are rooting, and then just finding some sort of solution or surgery or even weight loss injection at the end of the day. Like what is really solving the root cause? What is the root cause problem? Or are we just completely ignoring or unable to see what's going on until things become so distorted that we have to do something about it? And the last thing I was going to say about, the folk devils, and the last thing that you were just addressing, is that, again, when we are out of tune with nature, with ourselves, we lose the discernment to tell whether a folk devil is coming from a good place or not coming from a good place. So when they are outside of our normal realm, it could be somebody, in the Bible, there's this example where there was these two prostitutes, Delilah, and there's, I forget the other female's name, it starts with a T. And both of them were outliers in a particular situation. Both of them were prostitutes, but one was coming with a message that was actually going to kill Samson, cut off his hair and kill him. And the other prostitute actually had an outlier message that was going to shift the trajectory in a positive way for humanity. It's this issue that we're in now, is that we've avoided ourselves, our feelings, our connection with nature for so long that we're unable to, we don't see the value in prevention, in upstream addressing things. And now we're just lost in this miasma of, how do we clean up this mess? Like we're all firefighters just trying to clean up all of these messes, not really even understanding what's truly behind them. And then we have lobbyists or other people with these third-party interests trying to come in and offer 2 cents about what's going on, when in all reality, they really are so out of touch with what's actually going on. So we're in a messy, dire time where we're not seeing correctly.
Yeah. Yeah, massive panics, massive fears for sure. It's like a fire. You're right. It's like, oh my gosh, all this fire. We gotta get out the fire. But we can't understand where the fire is coming from because there's so much fire. I can see what you're saying. Crazy. And so, power doesn't just have these mental and psychological effects. We can even find some studies that show physical effects. Power causes brain damage, and this was published in The Atlantic 2017. Research by Dr. Keltner, if I'm saying the name correctly, a psychology professor at UC Berkeley, shows that people under the influence of power often become more impulsive, less risk-aware, and less empathetic. They act similarly to individuals with traumatic brain injuries. Sukhvinder Abhi, a neuroscientist at McMaster University, found that power impairs the brain's mirroring process, which is crucial for empathy. This means powerful people may struggle to understand others' perspectives. I mean, gosh, I feel like that is what most people struggle with. It's like, oh, I feel like I'm not being listened to. I need the laws to change. I need a new politician. And so there's this power paradox. The article discusses the power paradox, where the very traits that help individuals gain power, such as empathy and social intelligence, diminish once they have power. And there's empirical evidence. Various studies support these findings. For example, powerful individuals are more likely to draw the letter E on their forehead in a way that is readable to themselves but backward to others, indicating a lack of perspective taking. Very interesting study here. Figured to share. Think about that. Less risk aware, less empathetic, more impulsive, and lacking the mirroring, right? You could say this kind of right brain perspective.
It explains a lot of things, doesn't it?
Yeah. And then the other end of that is that a lot of times this power authority, nobody is holding them account. Again, just like the same, whatever's going on symbolically, it's the same issue where nobody is holding them accountable for the power imbalance or asymmetry more upstream.
Mm-hmm.
So in their head, what's the problem? Nobody's called them out. Nobody's held them accountable to anything prior to that. So I believe that they believe in and feel that they're doing a service very often because nobody has been able to either see what's actually going on or nobody's had the courage to actually call them out on it.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's also difficult because when you put that person in that position of authority, they assume they have that role and that there is nobody above them. to really, keep them in account. And so that is another problem, right? We talked about before with yoga. It's like this ego and this identification. Now everybody respects you in this position and they brought you to where you are, so you feel justified doing whatever you want to do in that position.
This is exactly where Leslie was mentioning that you can't really solve a a mental problem if it's a spiritual issue. And that's the thing, is that if we have individuals who understand that there's something above them, outside of them, it at least creates a semblance of humility to where I think the power at some point, at some point, I still feel that there's a recognition of when they're abusing it. But when you don't have a transcendent or anything above you, outside of you, anything bigger than you, I think you lose vision. You go blind to, the power corrupts. Absolutely.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting for sure, since, Jung said that too, right? He said it's not enough to have a moral, intellectual framework for your disobedience. You need to have something that's beyond you. You need to have God, essentially. So think of it what you will. I know a lot of folks who understand this like statism perspective who are atheist leaning, right? But I would say they still follow, principles in their life and the golden rule and the non-aggression and voluntarism. And would you say, Stephanie, that, these atheists, I mean, they're still looking up to something higher than themselves in such a case?
This is a tough one because I'm not an atheist, but I've seen some really good debates with like Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. Sam Harris, very famous in that arena. There's a lot of, there's a movement now towards atheists moving towards theology, but there, obviously there's some great debates, and it's difficult because I've seen a lot of great atheists, such as Sam Harris, really morally hold his ground regarding the fact that he, obviously he's still a good person, even though he doesn't have God above him, so to speak. It's a very tricky an area, and because I'm not an atheist, it's hard for me to understand. But at some point, it does seem like there's a glass ceiling that's hit, because you and us as humans are infallible. So that's another thing with God, and I'm really taking it out there, but when you realize that you have an imperfection and that there is a divine intelligence out there that has an ordered way of doing things that you might not be completely privy of because you're a human being and you're fallible. Again, it creates a humility, a space for humility. So when there's nothing above you but your morality, there's obvious flaw there, right? I mean, there's flaw. It's very difficult to explain. I don't know if I'm making sense or not. It's a difficult one. I'll have to come back to that.
I want to add a different way of looking at spirituality or thinking about it. If we think of spirit as, being kind of the breath of life, that which gives us life, right? If we're spiritual, we are in a state of awe and wonder simply about being alive. And in that state, we have a sense of purpose and value, for our life, for being alive, a sense of importance in relationship to the community and in relationship to life itself. That's what I think of when I think of a spiritual need or a spiritual problem. And so when we look at the abuses of people, then we are really seeing a devaluing of people and a treatment of people as not important and not having adequate purpose. And that is a spiritual problem.
Yeah, and I think that would correlate well with this perspective of, this person who takes this position of power and doesn't see someone that, higher than them in a spiritual perspective, or in this lens too of saying that they're spiritually bound to everybody else within their life and that they are on an equal playing field. They're all of this same value. Um, I think that definitely shares this perspective where now you have empathy entering the picture and mirroring and the golden rule, which has been taught, by the way, among all these different cultures and religions and spiritualities, despite having different ways of interpreting what that spiritual worldview exactly is. Well, there's more on this. Losing touch. Quote, dictators often exhibit extreme behavior, often in ways patently detrimental to their nations. Managers are often accused of not understanding their subordinates' points of view, and the dominant partner in a relationship often accused of being insensitive to the other's needs. David Owen, a British neurologist turned parliamentarian who served as the Foreign Secretary before becoming a baron, in his 2008 book, In Sickness and in Power, an inquiry into the various maladies that had affected the performance of British prime ministers and American presidents since 1900. While some suffered from strokes, like Woodrow Wilson, substance abuse, like Anthony Eden, or possibly bipolar disorder, Lyndon B. Johnson or Theodore Roosevelt, at least 4 others acquired a disorder that the medical literature doesn't recognize, but Owen argues should. Hubris syndrome is what he calls it, as he and a co-author, Jonathan Davidson, defined it in a 2009 article published in Brain, is a disorder of the possession of power. Its 14 clinical features include manifest contempt for others, loss of contact with reality, restless or reckless actions, and displays of incompetence. So they see this syndrome taking place within these people who are in power, and they say it's a disorder of the possession of power. They're calling it hubris syndrome.
If I can just add another biblical reference, I believe I brought this up earlier on, is that Adam and Eve and power dynamics here is that in the relationship between Adam and Eve, she was created as his other half, his helpmate, or a proper feedback loop. When somebody has a lot of power, where is their clear mirror feedback loop, kind of challenging them, like in a relationship, like really coming forth to make sure that they are seeing themselves clearly? I think this is what gets lost in power asymmetry and power dynamics, is that people start to look to the leader and start to worship the leader or feel like they can gain something by being under the leader. So people are afraid to genuinely confront and be that feedback loop that a power authority actually should absolutely have. We lose that equal mirroring feedback loop. So then pretty much, they can get high on their own supply, and all of the people underneath them aren't actually standing up and telling the leader the truth, so to speak.
Right. Leadership versus authority, right? The distinction between the two. Somebody who supports you and nurtures you, who you want to look up to, versus somebody who's demanding and making you comply using coercion, right? There is a difference we may be able to determine between the two, for sure.
That also relates to just having an equally balanced masculine and feminine energy, whether externally or within. So the power dynamic is the excessive left brain without the complement or value of the right.
Right. Well, here's another study, the brain under the influence of power. Power can deform the brain, making powerful individuals less empathetic and more self-centered. This is similar to the behavior seen in psychopaths or patients with frontal brain damage. And then there was modern replications. A 2017 study at McMaster University showed that wearing a police uniform made participants more attentive to low socioeconomic status individuals, highlighting how power symbols can influence perception and behavior. Research using transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, found that people primed with high power scenarios showed reduced activities in brain areas related to empathy. So heard from several studies now, this idea of empathy not being present, which is, of course, a trait among psychopaths. And, who is it that really seeks power? Who is it that wants power over their fellow man? We have to ask these questions. And even if it's people who they want to do good, right? We warned about this many times within our seminar of people who want good or support others for maybe really good justified reasons. How are they putting that out into the world? right? And how are they going to make others comply? Do they want others to comply? I mean, there's a question still of that, regardless of what they're thinking.
Corey, I'd just like to add, for every person out there that is low in empathy or is power hungry or abusive in power, we also have another problem in society where we may have an equal number of people who are overly empathic and aren't standing up in right energy and right balance. So I think that when I hear this stuff, I always think about this on this spectrum of societally we're very imbalanced, and we can blame the abusers, but we also have people who are on that other end of the spectrum, and for whatever reason, maybe have to do some healing work of their own or get the right support because maybe they're using their overly empathetic nature to actually manipulate reality because they've been traumatized or they have a lot of emotional things they need to work through. So it is both ends of this spectrum that really need to be addressed. And I think about balance, which again kind of pulls me back to the East a little bit, which is more about, working on that balance and seeing that there are those other people that exist too. And we've seen that a lot play out over the last couple of years politically, with people using victimhood narratives to control the dynamic, which again is another imbalance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would actually argue there's more of those individuals who are empathetically imbalanced than there are these individuals that these studies are pointing out. Because of course, there's many people who are following one or few people who are in power. So, you're right. I think there maybe isn't studies necessarily looking at that, or maybe we don't have them listed here. But, statism and this belief system we're mainly talking about is taking place within the populace, the followers, not the leaders. The leaders are kind of just the result of that. So there is a big problem with people just trusting and allowing it to happen. And we talked about the bystander effect that takes place. All these different mentalities take place within the mass, the collective whole. I think we're mostly talking about that, but it is important to recognize the results of that too, is this deformation. So we want to keep our humanity, and moving into the age of AI and with emerging technologies, maybe there's some synchronicities here with what we're promoting.
The abuse of power will have an effect on the minds and nervous systems and physiology of the people exposed to that abuse. So it becomes a cycle and a deeper and deeper hole that gets dug until people understand, and really see the dynamics and do the extrication that's needed from the abuse and do the healing to gain perspective and integration and personal empowerment.
I'd like to think that I think it's naive for me or us to think that we're going to return in some sort of state of nostalgia to a place where, well, if we were just all ourselves, everything would be okay. And if we could just accept people as they are, everything's going to be okay. I'm not hopeful that we're going to return to that nostalgia, and that instead we all are being called to mature, and as we grow up, to emotionally mature and do our work and become more self-aware, because communication and has become very difficult. Because again, I think that we have so many layers of masking over many of us that we're not communicating appropriately, because legitimately we actually don't even know how we feel, and we're siding with what feels the best to us and what makes us feel like we have power. So it's just very convoluted. So I think the call towards, as we become an adult, to do this self-work isn't going to be a luxury anymore, or something that's done for psychologists or people into Carl Jung. I think it's going to have to be a necessity if we want to try to communicate effectively with any bit of love and not destroy our civilization.
I'll go so far as to say that I think that we all have some degree of brain damage, that we all have, effects from the statist system that we live in. And we are in a defensive psychological state. We have damage that we are not even aware of, and won't have the ability to really desensitize from or heal while we're still in the dynamic. So one of the concepts for recovery from trauma is to get out of the abuse dynamic. And that's hard to do when it's like the soup we're swimming in, as part of our day-to-day life.
Um, yeah, right. Yeah. So there we have the question then is what is happening to us, right? We know what's happening to the person in power, but gosh, do we know what's happening to our brains in this process? Maybe this is a call for outreach. What is happening? Let us know. Has there been studies on it? Have we not detailed it perhaps enough on a scientific study point of view? Do let us know.
There's such a pull, especially now with AI and technology, to find solutions. Again, this is, the left brain wants to find solutions, right, to all of these problems. But at some point, we're not going to be able to keep up.
Yeah.
We have to almost like decompose, decondition, and really ask the real questions, which is what is happening to us? What's wrong? What's really wrong with me, right? Instead of just seeking externally for all these solutions. I mean, I think that's why AI is perceived as a potential savior, because human beings have realized, and science and medicine is, I can't keep up with all of this crap going on. Oh, thank God, here's a robot. They'll be able to figure it all out for us, instead of just really decomposing, disintegrating, going within and saying, what is actually happening?
Yeah.
We have to remember who we are and see the systems at play that are keeping us in this mentality.
Right. Well, what may be accused of individuals who, are thinking opposite of the mainstream and saying that there is this solution of perhaps getting beyond all the identities and beyond all the governments and beyond these systems, is they may be called the rebels. They may be called mentally ill. Right. So here, Bruce Levine expands on this. Gaining acceptance into graduate school or medical school and achieving a PhD or MD and becoming a psychologist or psychiatrist means jumping through many hoops, all of which require much behavioral and emotional compliance to authorities, even to those authorities that one lacks respect for. The selection and socialization of mental health professionals tends to breed out many anti-authoritarians. Psychologist Russell Barkey, one of mainstream mental health's leading authorities on ADHD, says that those affected with ADHD have deficits in what he calls rule-governed behavior, as they are less responsive to rules of established authorities and less sensitive to positive or negative consequences. ODD young people, according to mainstream mental health authorities, also have these so-called deficits in rule-governed behavior, and so it is extremely common for young people to have a dual diagnosis of ADHD and ODD. So he asks a question here. Do we really want to diagnose and medicate everyone with deficits in rule-governed behavior? Albert Einstein, as a youth, would have likely received an ADHD diagnosis and maybe an ODD one as well. Albert didn't pay attention to his teachers, failed his college entrance examinations twice, and had difficulty holding jobs. However, Einstein biographer Ronald Clark, in his book Einstein, The Life and Times, asserts that Albert's problems did not stem from attention deficits, but rather from his hatred of authoritarianism, Prussian discipline in his schools. Einstein said, "The teachers in the elementary school appeared to me like sergeants, and in the gymnasium the teachers were like lieutenants." And this, by the way, is an exact parallel to what we talked about before. The nature of the schooling system is based on the Prussian model of schooling.
And just for clarification, ODD stands for oppositional defiant disorder. And so it's basically a description of children who defy authority and don't follow the rules. So they're just automatically given this diagnosis sometimes, but it doesn't talk at all to causal factors or contextual factors.
Yeah. Very interesting. I can say for myself, I was very obedient growing up. I was one of the few kids that actually did everything that everybody told me. I didn't break the rules at all, right? And I talk to people and I find it very interesting because I'll meet people from all sorts of different backgrounds and all sorts of different childhoods who start to come to this realization of understanding statism and these belief systems. And so, does it really make a difference at the end of the day? I'm not sure, but I do know that this overdiagnosis problem that we talked about before can be an issue, and we might be medicating and causing more problems than what needs to exist, and be pushing out the potential of these individuals by simply not opening up and listening to them and realizing that, we don't have to throw this label on them, as we mentioned before.
Or to provide a, individualized learning environment,
Hmm.
and really understanding the child's individual learning styles and processing, styles and things like that.
Right. Well, Bruce Levine has a lot of great information regarding these mindsets and dives pretty deep. He says many people with severe anxiety and or depression are also anti-authoritarians. Often a major pain of their lives that fuels their anxiety and or depression is fear that their contempt for illegitimate authorities will cause them to be financially and socially marginalized. But they fear that compliance with such illegitimate authorities will cause them existential death. Right. So we're wondering, how much is it important to look at freedom in regards to health? Well, he's saying, anxiety and depression can be based in wanting this freedom that we just need to find. And so he says authoritarians, by definition, demand unquestioning obedience. And so any resistance to their diagnosis and treatment created enormous anxiety for authoritarian mental health professionals. And professionals feeling out of control labeled them non-compliant with treatment, increased the severity of their diagnosis, and jacked up their medications. This was enraging for these anti-authoritarians, sometimes so much that they reacted in ways that made them appear even more frightening to their families. Americans have been increasingly socialized to equate inattention, anger, anxiety, and a mobilizing despair with a medical condition and to seek medical treatment rather than political remedies. Political remedies, right? What better way to maintain the status quo than to view inattention, anger, anxiety, and depression as biochemical problems of those who are mentally ill rather than normal reactions to an increasingly authoritarian society? Authoritarians financially marginalize those who buck the system. They criminalize anti-authoritarianism, they psychopathologize anti-authoritarians, and they market drugs for their cure, he puts in quote. And work by psychiatrist Julius Koch also affirms how people could become pathologized, to enforce societal norms. So all of this is kind of helping us understand maybe there needs to be that societal change that we've been talking about. He says, get up and stand up. Learned helplessness. Levine explains how repeated exposure to oppressive systems leads to a sense of powerlessness, where individuals believe their actions cannot bring about change. Similar to victims of abuse, the population becomes demoralized and compliant due to continuous psychological manipulation by powerful elites. And so there's this institutional pacification. Major institutions, media, education, government use psychological tactics to maintain control and suppress dissent. Self-respect. Levine emphasizes the importance of individuals reclaiming their self-respect. This involves recognizing one's own worth and rejecting the internalized messages of inferiority imposed by authoritarian systems. He wants to build collective confidence, he says, achieved through shared experiences, mutual support, and celebrating small victories to foster a sense of collective efficacy. So, moving in the right direction, this is what he's recommending. We need to build confidence, maybe some self-worth, right? Like Leslie said, we need to find our value within ourselves, our purpose, our meaning. And maybe that means, seeking that higher power and seeing what unites all of us rather than drives us apart.
I just want to add, Corey, I think three very important things to add on are the components of self-worth or self-love, agency, self-agency, and self-efficacy. If we can find a way to work towards embodying those amongst the institutions that people maybe lie within, maybe we'd see a little bit of a shift. But right now, that doesn't really allow for that.
And some of the knowledge that we have now that wasn't available to us some decades ago, psychology saw things in terms of, in physical response, fight or flight. And if you want to go back a slide there, I want to point out that first part, that sense of powerlessness, we can now correlate that to fight, flight, or freeze. And that's kind of a new addition to the psychological or to the psychology range of responses that we have to stress, duress, or trauma. So if we have trauma and freeze was one of our responses, that can be sort of a self-perpetuating thing for people who fall into powerlessness. And maybe for some people to recognize where that comes from can be empowering in itself.
I was going to say the fawn is another response. And I see that in regards to what we were talking about with the psychopathic leader, and the middle management or the people underneath them can actually be in a fawn response. And again, not being that clear mirror because they're looking to gain something or to fawn after the leader.
And that can come from a sense of not feeling safe if you defy. So it's about self-preservation sometimes, and like, okay, I'm going to make this person happy. I'm going to do what they want. I'm going to be a star for them because then I'll be safe, instead of focusing on what's right or true, or finding a way to extricate from that unsafe situation. I think people just assume this is the way it is and the way it has to be, and aren't aware of these dynamics on a deep level.
I think that's one of the reasons why the complications over the last several years with the virus and the repercussions of that amongst the healthcare system has been as, complex and complicated as we have seen, because when you're in that dynamic, that tribe dynamic, and you feel safe and you're fawning after the leaders and they're, you're all safe in that environment, but to the outside world, it looks ridiculous. But they feel very safe, and they're dancing on TikTok and doing these things and awarding each other at ceremonies, and because they're in their own little world of safety, perceived safety, right? So when something comes along to challenge that safety, there's several or few doctors who have really come out against that. I mean, the immense courage of them to stand up for what's right, to be willing to lose it all, and some of them have, to go against their tribe, to go against their entire identity. Kudos to them, because those are the ones who are doing the real work.
Wow. Yeah. You gave a whole list of them before. It's incredible seeing how courageous they are, for sure. And these are not, homeopathic, naturopathic, alternative medicine practitioners. These are medical professionals. These are people who didn't learn about nutrition or yoga or somatherapy or any of the things we're talking about. They simply saw contradictions within the practice that they were already doing and seeing issues. So it's definitely systemic, and it's not just the alternative, right, practitioner seeing this.
Where I have to bring up one other thing that I just saw in regard to what you just said is that when somebody does wake up or decide to go against the tribe based off of factual information that, their morals, their beliefs, because there tends to be an awakening and a polarization as the information flows in, the truth flows in. I know a doctor here in Houston who has been getting the information, coming to her own truth, coming to the reality of what's going on. And as she shares her message, the judgment that's put upon her from her old tribe. And I've seen people say, oh, she sounds traumatized. So there's like an immense amount of gaslighting happening then upon somebody who gets out of the system, speaks up for the truth. It's almost like you said, they're willing to immediately pin a diagnosis on her or a label on her because she has come out of the system and is saying this is wrong, and has some emotion behind what's going on. I've saw many people say, oh, she sounds traumatized. And it's like, well, if once you wake up, you too may be traumatized to this information. But again, that judgment of her tribe and that pinning a label on her just because she's going against the usual narrative is just the psychological dynamics are just profound to watch being played out here as people are waking up.
Well, I find that interesting. You're saying that there's like this trauma getting out of, would you say, another trauma? Like Scott, you had a experience of being in a cult. You shared it before in our seminar. You haven't gone too deep into, what exactly that cult was or what went on. But I don't know if you can expand on this because I know you talk a lot about trauma. And we mentioned before too that the individuals who experience power have symptoms very similar to someone who experienced trauma. So do you see any connections here in your experience?
Yeah, well, the world of the authoritarian cult of Scientology was a really good miniature society. And coming out of that, I've just noticed that we live in cult-like conditions in the larger world. And but I got to experience a more intense version of that, kind of a militarized paramilitary organization. And so leveraging power and authority in those environments gives you the experience of those kind of reactions you get physically, and that are a little less pronounced in the society, but very much used in advertising and social control and various aspects of society. So yeah, it opens your eyes to the fact that we're not, truly free and in our societies in the modern world, and we have a long way to go, and that it's basically quite an authoritarian cult, and it has lots of reinforcements around it. So understanding these actions is vital in oneself in order to come out of it and help bring others out of it.
Okay. Would you say, sorry, I want to ask, would you say it felt traumatic for you to escape it? Like Stephanie mentioned?
There was trauma in the process of coming out, and I would say most of it was in those years where I began to become aware more and more of what I was in. And that also just because of the period of history and that development of that cult, it was actually getting worse and worse. And I was at the same time becoming more aware of those factors developing.
Okay.
And more aware of myself, so that I was able to notice what was going on and sort of navigate my way out of it. It could have been a lot worse if I had not had, begin to observe and think for myself a lot earlier than when the crisis came.
Sure. Yeah, Leslie, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to just reflect on how, when you really believe in something and you dedicate your time, your life, your energy, and you think it's good, and then you see evidence to the contrary, that's very disillusioning, right? That's very distressing. It's upsetting. It's like the foundation can be pulled out from under you, something that you built your life on. So I think that is an aspect of how it can be traumatizing, and when you care, and then you come out publicly and you say, hey guys, we've been basing our lives on some lies here, see what I see. And then they're like, oh no, you were wrong. You must be crazy. And then, there can be alienation, social alienation, which is a really distressing experience for people. So
Right.
there's lots of ways that this can be traumatizing. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And the feeling is one of deep betrayal, because as you pointed out, the things that you thought you were there to do, you're have turned around completely. So that betrays your trust.
Mm-hmm. And that's been a new term in healthcare as of late, is institutional betrayal.
Yeah, thank you guys for introducing these terms, like Scott mentioning fight, flight, or freeze. I mean, wow, amazing, amazing analogies. Thank you. And we have to ask the question, talking about medicine and politics, doctors, can they themselves be authoritarian? And Bruce Levine argues, yeah, many doctors are authoritarians and harmful. And he references a book on Nazi doctors, Alessandra Coliani. And she says that physicians joined the Nazi party and the killing operations not at gunpoint, not at force, but at their own volition. There is not a single reported case of a physician who was shot, incarcerated, or penalized in any way for refusing to participate in the killing operations. And so he identifies variables responsible for this: rigid hierarchy, the lack of questioning authority, right, which is like the whole premises of understanding statism. He gives a quote here. Among psychiatrists, psychologists, and other mental health professionals, there are a handful who risk their career to resist harmful authority, like we've been talking about. But most do not. And I believe that anti-authoritarian patients should be especially concerned with authoritarian psychiatrists and psychologists, perhaps even more so than with other authoritarian doctors. While an authoritarian cardiothoracic surgeon may be an abusive jerk for a nursing staff, that surgeon can still effectively perform a necessary artery bypass for an anti-authoritarian patient. However, authoritarian psychiatrists and psychologists will always do damage to their anti-authoritarian patients because anti-authoritarian non-compliance creates anxiety and often even shame for authoritarian doctors, and their anxiety and shame fuel harmful diagnosis and treatments.
I just want to add, Corey, real quick. It has to be stated here that anyone watching this who's a physician or provider, we're not assuming that you're a Nazi doctor. We aren't. Please don't reduce to what we're saying to that. It's just very important to look within ourselves, each other, yourself as a healthcare figure, a provider, and ask yourself, where does this live within you? And really just take a deep dive into how you may embody certain characteristics like this and see how we can do better. Because if you are in a state of authoritarianism, usually your patient will mirror you by being in a state of disempowerment. And that's not what I know you want as a provider. What any provider wants is to contribute to a disempowered state for their patient.
He also mentions one of the reasons for this authoritarianism in doctors is career ambition, right? And detachment from emotion or care, medical terminology, and euphemism, right? And there's, of course, a lot of euphemisms that we have identified before, and governments even use a lot in their political speeches to mask up perhaps the more direct action of, hey, I want to take your money, or, we got to do violence to somebody. They'll say it's instead under these other terms like protection and, oh, this certain law. And they may even, call it something that sounds really good, right? Like the Liberty Act or the Liberty Law or something of that matter, when it may be perhaps the exact opposite. And again, you can look back in history, many examples. We're not saying this is what everybody is doing. We're simply saying this is what has been done. And it's incredible to see that people out of their own volition will do this great evil without any threat or force being put upon them. And so resisting authority, depression can be a response to living in an oppressive society and should be addressed, right? We've talked about trauma being a reaction as well. People should maintain healthy relationships while resisting authority. This includes setting boundaries, communicating effectively, and finding supportive communities. People should raise children to be critical thinkers and resist authoritarian influences. This involves encouraging curiosity, fostering independence, and modeling anti-authoritarian behavior. For critical thinking, he recommends understanding propaganda, recognizing logical fallacies, and seeking out diverse perspectives. He highlights the importance of independent media to provide alternative narratives and counteract mainstream propaganda. He shares how civil disobedience, critical thinking, and support groups can help to remedy. He encourages mindfulness, self-care, meditation, and philosophical reflection. He argues that there is a form of bigotry directed at individuals with rebellious personalities. This can manifest in various ways, including social ostracism, legal persecution, and psychiatric labeling. So this is something just to be wary of, right? Because we shared before, Benjamin Rush, the father of psychiatry, making a label saying anarchia for anybody who disobeys authority and the government. And he encouraged within the school system, all the kids within these different schools coming into America need to know that no matter what, don't follow your parent, don't follow even God, like follow the government. Like that is the most important thing to follow, right? In his text, Education in a Proper Republic. And so we have this control freak model versus a healer model. And he says most people who enter the mental health profession truly want to help others, but they are often naive to the reality that the selection, socialization, and training processes are fear-based, aimed at creating control freaks who then become unhelpful. Most mental health professionals, especially psychiatrists, are naive to the reality that those professionals who are helpful have rebelled against their socialization and training. And again, Albert Einstein is somebody who has contributed tremendously to the field of science, and yet he's somebody who was very much an anti-authoritarian in his childhood. And so he says, sadly, the majority of professionals do not rebel, and so only a minority of professionals are truly helpful. Genuine healers have acknowledged their wounds and opened themselves to healing, right? Like even just among the discourse we have here, presenting this information, you can see that, we're asking questions to each other, we're learning about each other, we're opening up and sharing our experiences, we're not afraid. And I think that is something just to say is very important, especially for our humanity, right, which we say we might be losing. And so their wounds become a formative, positive experience, creating a deep connection and compassion for the pain of others that results in acceptance and not manipulations. Healing occurs when there are healing conditions which encourage openness. These conditions allow us to naturally move toward wholeness. If we can create the conditions for healing, healing will naturally occur, right? And that is definitely a very Eastern perspective. Is like healing we have within our ability. We simply need to let it happen. So let go of those things that are causing a hindrance and preventing that from occurring. He says, in our insane society, we are told that we must seek experts to fix all of our problems, and this results in missed opportunities. People, by virtue of being alive, can heal and be healed. There are all kinds of roles in which healing can take place. He says our increasingly control freak society creates directly and indirectly emotional suffering and behavioral disturbances. Insanely, those charged with reducing our emotional suffering and behavioral disturbances are trained to be control freaks who then increase our emotional suffering and behavioral disturbances. Thus, healing can only occur with rebellion from such insanities. Isn't that incredible to see someone say healing could only occur with rebellion, with freedom? And again, this is a connection that you see across many of these different researchers, and which is why we're entering the conversation saying, hey, why isn't this being looked at? This idea of the rebel maybe being an essential aspect of society. Albert Camus wrote a whole book talking about the rebel. It was like a bestseller, talking about this very idea.
Authoritarianism is the enemy of freedom, and particularly personal freedom and self-determinism. And I mentioned earlier that I was in a authoritarian cult, and that's true. The interesting thing is, and it attracted rebels, and I was one. The interesting thing is that the therapy within it presented and was very strict in an authoritarian way, that you were to be non-authoritarian as a therapist. And that's what was the attraction to it, was that the therapy was geared towards self-determinism, which is also the ideal of psychology, especially the psychology that's being presented here, the psychology that's going to transform our society away from authoritarianism and towards self-empowerment, self-determinism, which means better health, which is the subject of our presentation. So the whole idea of, it's so important that we get that the psychiatrist and psychologist who is authoritatively trained or, trained under authoritarianism is exactly the opposite of what we need and want, towards freedom. It's not any help to society. And as he points out, it creates control freaks. And those aren't the people that people want to talk to and to alleviate their worries and problems. And that creates a lot of tension, to put it mildly.
I just wanted to add a subtle nuance in regards to the healthcare field and naive or new graduated doctors as opposed to the system that they live in the hospital setting, is that I've seen a lot of young providers and residents kind of adopt a authoritarian attitude just to feel protective against their elders, which then translates onto their patients. So I think, again, Leslie bringing up the concept of how the relational dynamics really can affect individuals. This is one incident that I've seen that and experienced that firsthand multiple times, where I can see the relational dynamics amongst the system or the institution are playing out in power dynamics. So then certain people have to adopt that authoritarian attitude to feel or give themselves a perceived, maybe that white coat syndrome they have. So they want to feel like they're more ahead, or they don't want to get degraded by the authority or the elder provider. And then that translates onto patient care.
And I want to ask, all the listeners, what does being rebellious mean to you in the context of your life and your work? What can you do that is rebelling, right? And I'm saying that may be meaning that you're thinking outside the box, that you're diagnosing differently than what you have been told, that you're developing treatment plans, different than how you're taught, or offering other modalities of treatment than is on your approved checklist. It may means, challenging the insurance companies, challenging your superiors, exploring outside approved research-based models, of treatment, really questioning what you've been taught to think and do. Those are all acts of rebellion that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And so notice also what kind of fear or emotional reaction comes up for you when, you think about those things. And is there fear? Where does that fear come from? What are you afraid of? How does that relate to what we're talking about?
And for a time in our culture, in the probably late 60s, early 70s, it came to its peak. Rebellion and the rebel were valued in the psychology community. And what happened? I would say that the financial disincentives came against that. The pharmaceutical industry came to the fore even more so than it already was, and began to influence the training of physicians and psychologists and psychiatrists. And so we lost that breakthrough that was apparent, in which we were going to begin to understand not all rebellion is good, obviously. And there's some that can be very antisocial, in the sense that not good for the other people. But conformity, as we've seen in all those experiments, et cetera, that were conducted, that kind of brought this movement to the fore. It's like these were psychologists that were freshly looking at these experiments that we've seen about conformity, and they were going, rebellion is the way out. Okay, and we've sort of lost that. It's been lost in the shuffle. It's been lost in the profit motive, that has taken over medicine. if it ever was free from that, but even more so than before because of the unique interaction of the training system, the media that's used, et cetera. And so we've lost that rebel instinct, and somehow we need to get that back.
And I think that the consequences of non-compliance have gone up. They've notched up a level to where people are risking, not only losing their license, but possibly going to jail for using a term you shouldn't use, or prescribing, or not prescribing something that, the consensus says you should. So what does that say? If you're making your decisions because of the fear of consequence of the system, I think it just reinforces what we're talking about.
Yeah. Scott, I think you gave a good example too of like how rebellion can be used as a means for authoritarianism. Of course, right, as every rebellion in history too is creating a new system out of the old, so it can still be conceived in trauma, right? So rebellion within itself is not necessarily a good thing. But of course, looking at rebellion from the sense of I'm thinking for myself and I'm being able to navigate this journey of my own body and then being able to open up to others and then recognize that may go against others, not fearing those consequences can be definitely, a very healing modality.
Just
Stephanie.
to add on to what Leslie was saying in regards to the non-compliance and going outside of the box, is that happens not just on the provider level, but on the patient level as well. So if you have a patient who says, hey, I want to monitor this a little bit before I do this, or they start to really reclaim that agency regarding their own health, if they've had a sickness, a lot of times it's a little bit deferred or dampened down by the provider, which again kind of diminishes the patient's ability to start to regain trust in their autonomy and their self and their care also, which can be dangerous. Can create codependency in a negative way.
And creativity is stifled. When you're in a fear-driven system, you're not allowed to think creatively. And therefore that leads to caps or limits on the innovation, on the actual healing potential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's a reflection on everyone involved, the mental health state of everyone involved. Let's say the medical industry with the doctors and patients, that patients will get into that state where they feel that way, that they can't break out or they can't communicate, or certain doctors feel they can't communicate about certain things. When that communication becomes compressed, it builds tension, and it goes completely against the idea of becoming more healthy. So we have, we're either going to get healthy and expand, or we're going to collapse and contract and be, in situations where it's an unhealthy situation. It's an unhealthy environment.
I've discovered experientially and from friends of mine that need healthcare is that the model is to promote codependency, and even in an adult. And yes, we have extreme circumstances that happen to us physically where we need more care at a specific time for a specific reason. But then in terms of lessening that care, sometimes in certain situations, I have discovered that it's like a desire for the patient to have a codependent relationship with the model. It's like, did you get your 6 month this, 6 month this, year this, year this? It's just, to me, it feels as though if you're a good doctor, you want to be able to kind of kick the bird out of the nest. You want the patient to be able to separate and individuate from the overabundance of care that maybe was once needed for them to start to flourish again. And I understand in few, maybe few serious situations or with elderly individuals that are very compromised, that might not be something that can be done. But for a lot of times you see this behavior replaying in individuals that are 20, 25, 30, and then they can't live in the model of getting healthcare for their condition unless they lower themselves to adapt to the codependent model, which never permits the patient to properly separate and individuate to become an empowered human taking care of themselves. And then I see this reflection of many healthcare providers. They've asked me, why are patients not empowered? And I often, and I've said directly, because you don't see how you're contributing to the disempowerment. So I think it goes both ways. Again, just bringing the information out there to discuss it like we're trying to do, I think is a first step to just be aware of the dynamic playing out. It's not just about blaming somebody. Maybe you have a part in that as well.
Absolutely. I'd say that's one of our main messages for sure is like, let's not point the finger at others. Let's start looking at ourselves, right? Let's go with him. Absolutely. In case, we want some bit of a recap, here's some more statistics. I know we talked about statistics before, but here are more that Bruce Levine goes into. I'm not going to read every single one here. But he says when an industry is grossing billions of dollars, it is easy to spread around millions to make many more billions. And he gives all these different figures about how the big pharma spends 6.6 billion yearly spending on TV advertising. There's all this money, right? From 2014 to 2020, pharmaceutical companies paid $340 million to U.S. psychiatrists to serve as their consultants, advisors, and speakers, or to provide free food, beverages, and lodging to those attending promotional events. And 75% of the psychiatrists in the United States received something of value from the drug companies, right? So there's clearly a lot of different interests going on here.
And it's very true and common, to work at a health center and have very regular visitations by pharmaceutical reps who are giving the providers education about their product based on their research. And there are different kinds of incentives, that are often, like subtle and definitely food driven at the minimum, right? To use these medicines. And then it's just, of course, providers are going to check them out,
Right.
Well, there you go. There's your powerful incentive to be a shut up and take your medicine doctor or psychiatrist of the authoritarian variety that I was trying to describe earlier.
Yeah. Now, he also talks about something called individual defect theory. So he says if a population believes that its suffering is caused not by social, economic, political variables, but instead by individual defects, this belief undermines political rebellion and maintains the status quo. Psychiatry's mental illness theories are a major component of what Antonio Gramsci describes as cultural hegemony, the prevailing cultural beliefs of a society that are social constructs implemented by the ruling class through favored institutions so as to maintain domination. Evolutionary geneticist R.C. Lewontin, neurobiologist Stephen Rose, and psychologist Leon Kamin in their 1984 book Not in Our Genes, Biology, Ideology, and Human Nature make clear that political ideology implicit in the individual defect theory of biochemical genetic determination. They say biological determination or biologism has been a powerful mode of explaining the observed inequalities of status, wealth, and power in contemporary industrial capitalist societies. Biological determinism is a powerful and flexible form of blaming the victim. So another perspective here to share, talking about this idea of the individual and not necessarily looking at this holistic picture of is the state, is the health system, is the school, are these affecting individuals? Well, certainly since a very young age, often they are. Now, going on to Ite Kander's work, she talks about this idea of anti-authoritarian elements, and he says, in fact, research upon research shows that anti-authoritarian elements, these methods have introduced to mental health treatment, actually provide a stronger, fuller recovery and patience. So she's saying that by introducing more freedom, introducing more self-autonomy and self-ownership, we actually see more healing, right? And this is supporting the previous researchers, and that they allow the patient's voice to be heard far more than ever before, enabling patients to verbalize their personal suffering in an environment that listens to them. In this way, the stabilizing home and open dialogue methods are comparable with and parallel to the unschooling education model and method, an approach that is also prospering and realizing itself these days. Now, if you're unfamiliar with unschooling, it's the idea of getting your kids out of the mainstream school system, out of the government schools, and perhaps, teaching them directly or having like a homeschool system type of setup where the student can learn what they want to learn, where the student is listened to, and the families start to bond more together. They have more time to do things like activities and community events. I actually did a whole interview with Dana Martin, who wrote a book called Radical Unschooling, and she was featured on many prominent mainstream news networks, actually talking about this idea, but she was attacked in the mainstream for simply saying, hey, this works for my kids, and so, maybe you should try it for your kids. Like, just an idea, right? Like, she found out a lot of people want this because they're finding out that mainstream schooling systems are not helping their kids. So she developed the whole model around unschooling. And now, Candor actually tells us specifically anarchism can present a clear voice saying that liberty is not an obstacle for quality treatment. It is rather the very basis of it. Right? So again, bringing back this idea of anarchism in the true sense of, self-ownership and not, again, getting emotional about it, not being a rebel, but simply saying, hey, I stand on my freedom. I'm not going to let somebody rule over me and tell me what to do with my own health. I'm going to listen to them, but they're not going to coerce me and use force and violence against me. I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to set my boundaries clear. And so you could say it's a very healthy relationship that we have to form with ourselves and the world around us.
And I would say in today's world that just claiming that what you just said there is rebellious. It is an act of rebellion in our world today.
Yeah, perhaps so.
Sadly.
Is that my intent? Not necessarily, right? Like, I'm not trying to be the rebel. I'm just being myself, and I'm just saying, hey, liberty is something that we all seek. And again, depression, anxiety, these ailments can sometimes be based in an underlying need for freedom, but also like community, right? I want to be with other people voluntarily. I want to get together with them. And I realize there's a lot of constraints that prevents people from getting together in creating solutions because you have these centralized authorities. So simply asking those questions, introducing those solutions, is that rebellious? I think to me, it's just living life as the competitive free market perhaps is supposed to, right? As free ideas come together and people start to share, hey, this idea is better than yours. And so, of course, it would then filter out a better solution, perhaps, for the overall public. If it's allowed to persist, right? If we accept rebels, if we accept dissidents, if we accept competition in a healthy way like this. So we also have a problem of colonization, right? We talked before about tribalism, collectivism, and we're introducing more new ideas here. Well, colonization can relate to the fundamental, foundations to how these governments are formed. We talked about military and war, how that creates these systems. Well, colonization has a lot to do with that. It's like you got to create this new colony, right? And so Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist, argues that colonization fundamentally dehumanizes the colonized. The colonizers impose a sense of inferiority on the colonized, treating them as less than human. This dehumanization is both physical and psychological, leading to a deep-seated sense of worthlessness among the colonized. And again, I asked the question, can that persist through the generations once you start this foundation and all these people believe in this sincerely? Now you have this continual loop. They may bring it into the education system and they teach that. And sooner or later, people don't realize that's what's being taught, right? This is where the internalization comes in. He talks about it, internalized oppression. The colonized often internalize the negative stereotypes and beliefs imposed by the colonizers. This internalization leads to self-hatred and a fractured identity. The colonized begin to see themselves through the eyes of the colonizers, which perpetuates feelings of inferiority and self-doubt. And he talks about this identity crisis that takes place, right? They struggle to reconcile their indigenous identity with the imposed colonial identity, leading to confusion and psychological distress. The constant state of oppression and violence leads to various mental health issues we talked about before. Fanon, drawing from his experience as a psychiatrist, observed that many of his patients' psychological problems were directly linked to the oppressive conditions of colonial rule. He believed that mental health could not be separated from the socio-political context, right? You cannot separate these two things, and that true psychological healing required addressing the broader oppressive structures of colonialization. He also detailed how medicine was used as a tool of control. So bringing it all together, here's another, researcher sharing it through a different perspective.
Hey, Corey, real quick, this is off the air here, but I just watched last night, Am I Racist on the Daily Wire with Matt Walsh. I don't know if you guys have seen it, heard about it, but some of the stuff that we talk about, this in particular, can be so misconstrued with the same left narrative. Some of the things that they were saying, I believe that we are approaching it from an imbalanced state. Do you know what I mean? Whereas, like, if you watch this movie, like they're talking about colonization, they've mentioned shadow work, psychiatry. Like, I was really thrown by watching Am I Racist? Because it's like a lot of these people in the woke movement, it's like they're hijacking the ideology without fully understanding it, but it's making what we're saying look like it's connected to with what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
totally, and that's not a surprise.
Yeah,
and that's
So
we have to work harder at being clear about what we're saying.
Exactly, because everything Corey just said was pretty much what I heard this girl who was ridiculous say, but she didn't have the embodiment. She was angry. There are these nuances that I don't want somebody to, listen to what we're saying and throw us in that pit of like, oh, are these guys woke? What's happening here? Like, no,
if you don't mind,
I think it's a victim mentality kind of a thing in it. And are you putting is it like an external orientation to, we're the victim and this is what's been done to us and we deserve compensation, right? Versus I'm going to throw away this internalized oppression. I'm going to discard and purge myself of these false beliefs about myself and my tribe or my
I think I was not truly familiar with the teachings of the woke movement in as much detail as I learned yesterday. I didn't understand the teachings. So they were going around teaching everybody, right? And so that's why I'm sitting here wondering, thinking like some of the things that are similar, do we need to have a caveat? Not say like this is not woke, but do we have to?
I think that we might at some point do a video that differentiates, because this woke mentality is very prevalent in the mental health providers, in my field and therapy.
Absolutely. And it's funny that you brought that up, Stephanie. I didn't realize all that. But I was just about to bring up, and I will, maybe we can record it when we resume here, bring up that this whole passage that we just read, that the psychological problems are directly linked to the oppressive conditions of colonial rule. Thomas Saz, who is on the other end of the spectrum, a libertarian, they would say, the woke people would say right wing, although I've never seen libertarian as right wing. I was just about to draw a comparison saying that they would both agree on that very point.
Yeah, I think it's good. We should let you do that.
I think I should just include what you guys are talking about because there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, there's something kind of strange here and being honest about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I would maybe speak a little differently if I thought I was, but it's up to you, Corey, what you think.
I'm okay if you add it in. I think it's a really important caveat because if we're speaking to medical providers, they are so infiltrated with the woke movement. And that's not where I'm coming from in this information. And again,
Yeah.
we've gotten to such a complicated area to where it's like, honestly, guys, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's like, I don't know how much nuance I can provide
I
because
know.
it's getting so, it's just decomposing like right in front of us. Like,
One
we're
way
going
I
to have to
look
just
at
start to
it,
feel people and be like, oh,
it's a,
yeah, okay, this person has a good heart. I can feel you or I
yeah.
can't feel you.
I think
Yeah.
that there's like a stalling out on a phase of healing. Okay. When you start to realize the effects of history on your family's life and your own, suffering, it is going to be natural to have a phase of feeling victimized and feeling oppressed and feeling angry and wanting some compensation. That is a phase of
Development, awareness.
development and yeah, and healing, bursting through. But the political arenas it wants people to stay stuck there.
Right, right.
Right. Instead of moving out of that to the place of like, where does
Healing.
power lie? Am I going to stay in the place of, impoverished thinking and, you know, anger and resentment and looking to the very government body that did all of that horrific treatment, the colonizers, for the solution, and then if I join with them, I'm part of the oppressive class that destroyed my ancestry. But that some of those subtleties aren't really being talked about.
Mhm.
And it's not being talked about how you can create a parallel like model. You don't have to get your solutions from the state. If you really own your if you validate yourself and you know your value and you know that you are not going to live in a place of victimhood, then you do something different. You don't go begging and
They
whining.
always, they always say that, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. And be
Mhm.
prepared to get pissed off when you start to understand the truth. And, the other thing too is one consistent thread that we have going for us, at least in a very confused world, especially with communication and trying to express ourselves. We have one very solid thread that lives between all of us, which is the belief that self-awareness and the process of introspection and healing is primary. And nobody's really teaching this. It's always like, get your solutions. If you're pissed and you find out the truth, go destroy something. Go try to get, whatever you like, try to fill your void with something external. And that's not the way. That's revenge seeking. That's not really
Yes.
a mature way. Nobody is really proselytizing there's a better way, because that better way probably isn't doesn't incentivize higher capitalism and people to profit off of other people's anger and
No, or social
polarity.
controls, because this whole woke movement is leading to more and more social dominance and micromanagement of social
And
interaction.
more and more and more tyranny, more tyranny. And it's
Yes.
funny because the left used to be democratic. It used to be the opposite of what it stands for, but it
Yeah.
can't see itself. It
And that's
refuses
part
to
of the
see
problem.
itself.
That's part of the problem, by the way, is the left and right are interchangeably going through history. Sometimes with views that the other side had previously. And so us bringing it to the forefront, sometimes sharing research 20, 40 years ago can be a little complicated, right? Because then people will start mixing it with today's ideology and mixing it with what they know currently in the present moment. So I think people have to be able to look at the context and look at the nuance for themselves and just try not to assume as much as possible. But like even the word woke, right? I mean, even the very word, I mean, I'm afraid that has issues because, of course, we use within our presentation often, oh, are you awake? Are you seeing what's going on? And so it's like the words definitely mess with us a lot, the left and the right and the woke. And that's why I don't usually use those terms. I like to kind of look at what's going on. But I know that colonization can be assumed as like racism, or even slavery. When I talk about slavery, it can be assumed automatically as racism. When I'm looking at it like in a much deeper way, right? And I usually try to sympathize and try to see who I'm talking to as well. Right? Because I think I can agree with everybody if I understand them from a fundamental level. I can understand where they're coming from and see why they have the mindset that they have.
Awakening is a term that's been around for a very long time, and it's a spiritual term.
Right.
It's a spiritual term. And the difference between why I'm not afraid to say awakening is because personally that's exactly what happened to me, and I would consider myself still along an awakening journey. But when somebody comes out of the blue and claims woke, to me that describes an aspect of time that hasn't been deserved. It hasn't been earned. It's you're woke from what? Where was your process? Where's the feminine? How did you come to this information? All of a sudden you're saying I'm woke, which would imply the time of like I've already done the work and now I'm here and I no longer need to learn because in time I'm further ahead and I already know what I need to know. The awakening is more humble, it's more accurate, and it's saying as humanity we are waking up to some things that are uncomfortable and we're learning how to integrate, process, and heal from those things. So I knew right off the jump when somebody said I'm woke or woke that something was wrong.
Well, this is important.
So
Just like I'm going to keep this all in, our recording, so people will hear how we're honest about this, because this is just an example of something that is being talked about in our social, economic, political climate that is affecting people's minds and thus affecting their actions, and then what they want imposed on others through law. So, I think it's a good example.
To me, woke sounds like a hijacked term that possibly began as an authentic, even if it began on the left, or I think it probably began amongst the Black community, because I get that idea from their jargon or their lingo that comes from that. And that maybe even in the Christian Black community, because I've used a lot of Christian ministers use it, that was the first that I heard of it. And I think it was the idea that I'm waking up to something, to the reality of things. And it would be great if they came all the way and embraced, all viewpoints. But none of us are really, very few of us are really doing that. I shouldn't say none of us. But I wanted to say something go ahead, Leslie.
No, go ahead, Scott.
To the listener who is aware of Fanon's Marxist leftist background, he was an author of several of those kinds of books. And really, what one can take from it, and is the victim model, or the victimization of people. But I'm not sure that's what he intended either. And I just wanted to point out that Thomas Saz, from the other end of the political spectrum, the libertarian psychiatrist, he would agree completely with that statement that psychological problems are directly linked to the oppressive conditions of colonial rule, or whatever the larger society is. And we've talked about that earlier on, is that really the problems and solutions we can find agreement on, regardless of the politics.
Yeah, Scott, I think you're right. And this is what I don't hear enough people talking about, is that there are some things on the left that need to be heard. There's a reason as to why this narrative is being pushed. And as I wasn't too crazy with how it all came about and the violence that incurred from it and things that were going on. The more I started to try to understand, the more I was thinking, why is this being pushed forth? What is the material underneath that people are dissatisfied with? I think that the way that it was done wasn't quite ready. I mean, it came out, but the response or the action asked for from the awakening, it didn't feel ready. It didn't feel matured enough to handle it in an appropriate way to help to instigate healthy change. It was more of that immature energy of this is wrong, let's destruct it, and I have no responsibility in it. That is the immature way to handle with something that information that you come into.
Right.
And I want to add that, most of the people, if not really all the people that I directly interface with who are influenced by the woke culture or call themselves woke even, are really caring people. They're coming from a place of compassion for individuals who are outcasted, who are marginalized, who continue to experience social abuse, really, there's a lot of prejudice against individuals, and their experience in their day-to-day lives is very, is a reminder of that, right? Often. And so I just want to point out that I think that at the heart, where people think they're standing is from the place of wanting fairness and equal rights and individual rights. So that's our commonality, because that from our hearts, that's where we agree.
Yeah.
It's the ignorance, I guess you could say, of this larger agenda and maybe not seeing how this over compassion, almost like this over empathy, it becomes that codependency that you get stuck and lost in the understanding of the suffering, to the point where then you're not pushing people to pop out of that into an internal power.
Yeah, it needs to be done with love. And I think that this is why we aren't seeing, I haven't personally seen that much vast change come from the woke movement. Maybe there have been little things that have been attempted to be changed, but overall, I haven't seen a humongous societal shift. Because again, I think it's not that we don't want equal rights and to change the wrongs and make them right or do what we can to do better. It's the way in which or it's what do you actually want to be done? Do you know what you actually want to see change? And is it coming from a place of love and not anger and greed and frustration and wanting to kill people? That never turns into something healthy or sustainable. So I think I know this for myself, again, when you come to the truth, it first pisses you off. You got to work on integrating that first, and then come back out deliberately with love and with a clear message and say, this is what needs to shift. How do we work towards this together in love? Not, I'm just going to take you down because you're the patriarchy and you all suck. No, there's work that needs to be done in that individual for sustainable change.
And I think that people are really seeking validation, right? Witnessing, acknowledgement, witnessing of this generational suffering, right? And I think that if that is appropriate to give the compassion and the acknowledgement, but then there's, if when you stay there, or you then turn that into a mentality that you owe me something, I'm owed, then that's where it becomes very unhealthy,
right,
and not really leading to true healing or true empowerment.
Yeah.
And we must
go ahead, Scott.
We mustn't forget what's coming through our social media feeds and our feeds, our media, and it's usually drives people, it polarizes people, so that you bring up, well, less government and more independence. Oh, that's right wing.
Right.
Or you want to address some social problems and some human suffering. Oh, that's left wing. And so if you're on one side or the other, you're trained, or you're conditioned, let's say, that's a better word. You're conditioned to reject the message right away. And we're bringing a message here that's non-political, okay? And we want to appeal to all people, but we do realize there are going to be people out there that have conditioning, and that some of these things need to be elaborated or explained because they sound shocking to somebody who has been on a social media feed for many years.
Yeah.
That those things are fine-tuned, and you're being conditioned. I am, everyone is.
Right. And though I will say is, based on what Leslie said, we mentioned the researcher Mark Passio before. He can tend to get very angry, very emotional about what's going on in the world. But is he asking, to be the victim? Is he asking for anybody to give him anything? So I think that kind of is an example of, Leslie, what you're talking about, how somebody can be angry and be like, yeah, I think it's unfair, the world the way it is, but they're not necessarily, because of that unfairness now, asking for the whole world to give them everything. And I see these same problems that we're observing here through, diet and people debating about diet too. So, I mean, I think it might be on not just the political realm, but many other things within our society too, of any particular divide where you can say, this is where, I'm right and you're wrong type of thing, right?
I think it goes back to I want to kill my opposite.
Mm.
I always want to kill my opposite rather than distill, work with, relate with, understand, disagree, integrate, let go of. It's a much longer process, right?
Yes.
And that comes with maturity and experience and a lot of failing. I mean, that's how I've come to this. So it is about, really, the moment you want to kill your opposite, there's something also within you that you can't see yet very often.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about grieving and feeling the awful feelings that come, with the recognition of colonization and oppression and generational abuses. Comes back to people learning how to manage their emotions and feel the pain without running.
Yeah. And I want to make it clear that the sources that I got, for a lot of the material, and you guys as well, we didn't look at what the political standing they had. Like, I literally looked for any material regarding authoritarianism, totalitarianism, and psychology, and relating a lot of the ideas we talk about. I don't care where they came from, what books they wrote, what side spectrum. It doesn't matter to me. You know what I mean? I cared about the material itself, and I looked for all of it. And we gathered as much as we could here, and we're open to more. So I just wanted to throw that out there for the audience in case they think there is any particular agenda being lined up. Like, Scott said, there's some like Marxist material. I don't know. You can probably throw a bunch of isms, and people probably will when they see different clips of this, right? And they see different parts of the seminar, and they assume, oh, that's what they are. That's what they're talking about. So just something to bear in
I
mind.
think the important thing that I would hope, I think that we're all trying to say is, can we see beyond the isms and see the heart
Right.
of what we're trying to say? And I think that's what we're going to have to do with everybody.
We might have to send this clip to everybody.
That's very true.
Social media is a big problem because if you start watching one video, it starts recommending you other videos of the same type or of a similar narrative. So you start watching one extreme, you start thinking everybody on this one side is of this one extreme very easily because that's all you're exposed to information-wise. It's incredible how easy it is to fall into not to these imbalances. But then how easy it is to also get out of them when you can simply approach it from like that Eastern perspective and say I'm done with all the identities and attachments, because then all the future ones won't matter either. It's like anything that comes to you won't really affect you when you have that foundation set and laid.
And add the trivium where you're open to, gathering as much information from as many sources as possible.
If you
right?
need information, right? At a certain point, it's like
I'm starting to think why can't I just love somebody and see them
Right.
correct? Like I'm almost done with all
Right.
politics, all
There's
agenda,
so
all
much
narrative.
information. Well, is the information that you're gathering, is it like you're in the weeds looking at he said, she said, he did that? That's where I come back to principle. I come back to looking at the dynamics
Sure.
of, that
Patterns.
are going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway.
The knowledge of
nice.
non-knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy though how difficult it is to.
It is.
How many nuances? Like, even when I hear us talking, I'm like, oh, that could be.
I know. Well, that's what I was going to say on my ego video. I actually have it written down as a note. It says, if you get in any ideology or any way of thinking from watching my videos, I failed to do what I'm here to do. Like, I wrote a list of things that says I failed if I did any one of these things, and I guarantee you I've done them, because it's almost impossible if you're a public figure with any thinking or voice whatsoever to help people get into the non-thinking being mode, which is the direct opposite. You know what I mean?
But then the caveat there is if you go into non-being mode, then you have people who were non-beers before who judge it because they've spiritually bypassed the
Yeah.
psychology of things. So it's like no matter where you go, there's those people who have been involved in that cult who now see that they're getting an outside perspective and then judging where they were. It feels to me like we're just broadening our perspectives and having a hard time where we're judging ourselves for where we were and then projecting that out onto other people.
Mm. So continuing here, the authoritarian formula, if we can try to really bring this into more of a concise message, Jeremy Sherman does a pretty good job here. He says it's easy to play God once one frees oneself from the meaning of what one is saying. The formula is simple. Say anything that makes you sound invincible. Anyone can employ the formula. Once one discovers the formula, conscience and reality atrophy as burdensome and unnecessary, right? This idea of conscience and reality we've been talking about a lot is often being negated in the presence of an authoritarian mind, which he is detailing here. He expands on this through what we can call the authoritarian act. And so this is what's behind the formula, what the formula is actually, doing in action. He says, be melodramatic, whiny, and theatrical, but with imperturbable gravitas and bravado. Anyone who agrees with you proves you're the triumphant hero. Anyone who disagrees with you proves you're the victimized hero. Moment to moment, you're a hero no matter what. Never explain or debate your mission. That would signal receptivity, which is a sign of weakness. All that matters is that nothing can or will ever be more important than your mission. Juggling priorities is for mere mortals. Of course, your real mission is maintaining the appearance of absolute authority. Feel free to change your mission moment to moment. That's easy too, since it doesn't matter what you say. Your hypocrisy will prove that you're royalty. If people call you on your hypocrisy, retaliate tenfold. They're the real hypocrites, which proves you're absolutely consistent. Hypocrisy is a status symbol. Kings and billionaires get to be hypocrites. Power sets you free. Pretend you're free and it will look like you have power. If you ignore what you say while insisting on it as the last word, the gullible will be seduced into supporting you, and the skeptical will get suckered into trying to debate you. That's them taking the bait on the false assumption that you care about what you're saying. One way or another, you'll get hooked on the formula, drunk on your power. The formula replaces conscience. Once one gets in the practice of saying anything to declare oneself the winner, conscience evaporates. It's no longer needed. It only gets in the way. So I like the way this is written. Very simple sentences to the point, but it's also shocking and horrifying to see it could be summarized like this in a very brutally honest way, which we may have to be, right, if we're going to be talking about this problem that we see throughout history. Notice the idea of pretension, of setting ourselves free, but not really free, of this seduction, this support, this suckered into. Just the words that are being used here, I think, signify what's going on here. The appearance of absolute authority, right? So it's a mask. It's not really like this person has authority, but they want to give that appearance so people follow them. And that goes back into the idea of statism and basically just creating a whole public perception to support that idea.
This calls to mind not only a few notorious cult leaders, but a lot of the personnel coming out of Hollywood that use this attitude and actually take authority over things they know nothing about. But because they're an actor, a famous person, they get to talk about it and they get to influence people about it. This is a very good slide to revisit for the character and modus operandi of such people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it brings to mind the concept of gaslighting and emotional manipulation, right? Being played out on this stage of that's theatrical in reality, and it leads to confusion for the people. You know, where you start to question your own perception.
Mhm. Yes. And then it's like any move someone makes, oh, I can use this for my power position. I could use this in politics. And, similarly, there might be philosophers who have great ideas throughout history, right? And they write out a whole bunch of different ways how we can make society better. The politicians may run with those ideas and say, yeah, that's something we should do to maintain their power in simply different ways, right? It's like, oh yeah, that's something communism, right? Oh, a whole new way of engaging with this system, but nonetheless, the system is still there. The rulers are still there. They're just choosing a different system to maybe make the people happier. And we see a lot of debates happening and people claiming they're right and the other person's wrong, and a lot of egos we might notice here, in regards to that whole idea of never explain or debate your mission. Don't look weak, right? Don't look into that right brain aspect of yourself. Fall in line to that authoritarian mentality yourself so you can also then impose it on others. And everybody's kind of stuck then in that left brain world. And then they don't know why. It's like, well, you have this mentality that is just festering and it's unable to be unraveled because every little thing is used to promote it.
Corey, I just wanted to add something interesting regarding Hollywood, is that a lot of people who have a talent, whether it be a musical talent, an acting talent, a specific talent, get that silver spoon treatment. They get up the ranks, they start, hanging out with the Hollywood individuals, and they get this power that really is stemming from their talent, not necessarily their knowledge. So it's kind of like a false sort of power and authority based off of something that they got to a position with that has maybe nothing actually to do with what they're supporting or that which they're talking about politically or whatever. So
It's who you know.
yeah, exactly. And
Yes.
then I have the right to talk about this because look at my crowd. Look at who I know. Look at who I am.
Right. Yeah. It says power sets you free. Pretend you're free and it'll look like you have power. Yeah. When you have money and the ability to do a lot more than other people, it's like, huh, okay, I want more of this and maybe want more attention. What could I be in next? And you start to get attached to it perhaps, and it becomes that reality.
And I think that these Hollywood people are pawns, in a bigger play here, being used because of their popularity and the way that people look up to them. So beware.
When you have that level of power, it really challenges the ego. And, we would hope that people of that status wouldn't think that they were better than the rest of the world. But at some point, you may lose your vision and not be able to relate with the general public as much because of the people that you tend to be around. So you do feel as though you have the right or the power or the hierarchy, and that the people lower than you don't understand, or they somehow don't have as much knowledge as you because they're not as famous or have as much power or money or influence as you.
Right. I gave the example before of Jim Carrey, right? So he had that realization because he was prompted up there and invited to all of the movies and TV shows. And he realized he was kind of losing his self, his internal self, that self he's always was looking for. And that there were some things in his childhood he was missing, and Hollywood was providing that to him. But it wasn't really like he was still finding himself. He had to do that separately. He had to acknowledge his ego, like you said.
Yeah. It's hard to not get drunk on your own power and influence. I mean, I don't have it, but I imagine I see it playing out, that I feel a lot of them just cannot see themselves for the reality that it is because they're just in the act. They have become the ultimate actor in it, on the screen and off the screen.
What I could also say too is David Lynch, right? I mean, he apparently died recently. As of us recording this seminar, I mean, he created transcendental meditation, like a lot of centers around that, and incredible, practices where people train each other how to like recognize these things. And so many people in Hollywood were aware of that because he was somebody very influential in Hollywood. So there's another example. So he expands on this, becoming the authoritarian leader. So he just basically breaks it down here. If we're just going to make some bullet points: unbroken certainty, the hero slash victim role, the melodrama, the supreme judge, right? I am going to declare myself the winner. And the outcome of all this is the formula creates an illusion of invincibility and moral superiority, often used by tyrants and those seeking to dominate. Notice moral superiority, right? And invincibility. And many people who are, I would say, the followers of these will say, well, who are we going to do? What are we going to do? We have no choice but to follow them. And if the world is going to get better, like, this is what we have to do. And so it's almost as if it's reinforcing the invincibility because in that position of power, because the people below them also feel like there's just no choice. Like, we have to go along with it. Here's a quote from Bob Altmeyer. Wannabe tyrants in a democracy are just comical figures on soapboxes when they have no following. So the real threat lay coiled in parts of the population itself, ready someday to catapult the next Hitler to power with their votes. Quite shocking, powerful words here. I mean, if you're at this point of the seminar, maybe it's not so shocking, but I still think it's pretty powerful if you're going to, I was talking with Stephanie before, start to connect some dots in relation to the world you currently live in and see perhaps some patterns in history and start to add more of that human, like, emotional bias into it as to, I kind of feel like that's where we're at now or where we were, and it's something to be aware of. Here's another quote from Stanley Milgram that would support that. He says, I would say, on the basis of having observed 1,000 people in the experiment that he did and having my own intuition shaped and informed by these experiments, that if a system of death camps were set up in the United States of the sort we had seen in Nazi Germany, one would find sufficient personnel for those camps in any medium-sized American town. So that means there's plenty of order followers or people who believe in this authority figure so much so that they are willing to break their own conscience. And again, Altmaier is saying, hey, it's not the leader, it's the follower. It's the population that's at fault here. Stanley Milgram's saying the same thing here. Like, you have people who are willing to support evil, but yet we're looking at the few people in power. What's up with that? So let's talk then about the follower. Jeremy Sherman continues here, not just talking about the leader, but also talking about the follower. And it's very important that we look at, both ends here. They are highly ethnocentric, highly inclined to see the world as their in-group versus everyone else. Because they are committed to their in-group, they are very zealous in its cause. They are highly fearful of a dangerous world. Their parents taught them more than parents usually do, that the world is dangerous. They may also be genetically predisposed to experiencing stronger fear than most people do. They are highly self-righteous. They believe they are the good people, and this unlocks a lot of hostile impulses against those they consider bad. They are aggressive. Given the chance to attack someone with the approval of an authority, they will lower the boom. Their beliefs are a mass of contradictions and double standards. They have highly compartmentalized minds. They reason poorly. If they like the conclusion of an argument, they don't pay much attention to whether the evidence is valid or the argument is consistent. They are highly dogmatic because they have gotten their beliefs mainly from the authorities in their lives. Rather than think things out for themselves, they have no real defense when facts or events indicate that they are wrong. So they just dig in their heels and refuse to change. They are very dependent on social reinforcement of their beliefs. They think they are right because almost everyone they know, almost every news broadcast they see, almost every radio commentator they listen to tells them they are. That is, they screen out the sources that will suggest that they are wrong. Because they severely limit their exposure to different people and ideas, they vastly overestimate the extent to which other people agree with them. And thinking they are the moral majority supports their attacks on the evil minorities they see in the country. They are easily duped by manipulators who pretend to espouse their causes when all the con artists really want is personal gain. They are largely blind to themselves. They have little self-understanding and insight into why they think and do what they do. I mean, my gosh. And of course, this is a gigantic slide. I don't know if any of the other slides I've written has this much text on it. But you can see it's because he goes deep into it, and I like how he breaks it down. So a lot you can unpack here, right? A lot you can. But again, notice here, I think some parts that I highlighted were relevant contradictions and double standards. Right? If we start asking ourselves some questions about statism and our belief in authority, and we ask the simple question, you know, would you do something that is wrong just because an authority says so? Something like that may pick up a contradiction, right? But there's other questions we can ask too.
I wanted to highlight the word dogmatic because I think that's an important word that summarizes this profile of people who are very zealous and have a religious fervor of dogma, a dogmatic belief about whatever it might be, whether it's about their political leaning or a social construct, about, something they value, and it becomes very emotionally based. And again, like it says, they're not vetting the truth. They're not vetting the facts. They're not going to those extra efforts to really make sure that what they're told is true, but attach and cling to that thing. And I think this is happening in vast numbers. We see it on the news and in social media and in the political arena.
Yeah.
It's a very, very big deal.
Yeah, this might be a bit of an oversimplification, but it seems like this is the appeal to the ego, and that these people, the authoritarian followers, are easily appealed to in their egos. So they're having definitely issues with their egos, it seems.
It's much easier to defend the dogma and have an emotional reaction about anybody that challenges that than to change your belief system. Because when you change your belief system, you have to face your ego, which means you have to admit maybe you've been wrong. And then maybe you have to understand that you've cultivated and created a life around you that adheres to that dogmatic belief. So really dismantling the ego or making a true big change in your life does take work. But when you are unwilling to lean into that and question and do the work, you're ultimately left with becoming emotionally attached to the old dogmatic belief. That's all you have.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that underneath that dogma is an element of fear, and a fear of losing security or safety in their world. So I encourage people to reflect on their strong opinions and look at the psychological patterns within yourself and how much of that is based on fear.
To reduce this a lot, it just reminds me of, do you want to stay comfortable in your life? Because nothing good grows in a comfort zone. So sometimes we do get more comfortable in places that we've outgrown. But again, like Leslie said, we're fearful because we know that if we admit it, we have to change, and that takes work.
This just brings it back full circle to me, to what we talked about with spirituality and religion. When it comes to any position anyone would have at all within their lives regarding, politics or other matters, are we able to let go of that? And, how much of an attachment do we have to that? Because it can seem rather difficult, if we are digging our heels into something and then, thinking we are right, and perhaps very much so, unable to see any sort of nuance whatsoever when 9 times out of 10, there almost always is. We just don't necessarily always see it. So, isn't that interesting? Like, Stephanie, I don't know what you have to say about that. Would you say spirituality comes in here and people should not ever really be so set on their worldview? Or can there be a grounding on their worldview? Because this can seem confusing to somebody who is like, okay, well, then where am I supposed to stand? Right? Like, do I become an anarchist like we talked about before? But that's still like a point of view, right?
The only thing I can say is that this is a difficult one because you have to be able to, sometimes life is paradoxical. Let's just say that. So let's just say that there are objective truths in our world, but you have to be willing to continuously reflect and go within, which is something that we talk about a lot, and to really ask yourself the deep questions and be willing to check with yourself more often than not on your stringent, rigid belief systems to see if maybe you're missing the mark or if you can grow and evolve in any way. So it has to be, we want to work towards that balance of pliability and flexibility with life and non-attachment with also understanding objective reality.
That's a great way of putting it. And I would just say that the essence of inner work is reflecting and reevaluating incidents of your past. And you can apply the same thing to beliefs. If you find a belief or you find a fear inside of you, it's good to question it and reflect on it. And the essence of inner work is reevaluation. Does it make sense? Is it logical? And there's a lot of tools that can help with that. But that's just the simplicity or the basics of it.
It's not always that easy because sadly, for some of us, we run more on emotions than logic. And that could be for a variety of reasons. We don't want to not have emotions because it's a great guidance system to understand what your emotions are revealing to you as messengers. But when you live an emotionally based life, you tend to lose the ability to be logical and objective, but you don't necessarily want to be so logical that you're losing the ability to feel. So again, it's a fine balance. But Scott, I think you're completely right that you want to be able to look at things practically and logically and realistically, but that for some is not that easy because of past trauma, or again, they're living out components of their past that are creating a boundary system within their ability to flow and move in their life, and they're living their life more emotionally than maybe they even realize and not really logically.
Thank you for expanding on that. And so, we can perhaps relate the idea of a follower or somebody who we may say is programmed to that of a machine. We talked about before, this idea of technocracy and putting robots inside of people. Well, Jeremy Sherman even wrote a little poem here about the mechanistic mode. He says, minds are not computers, language is not code. Thinking that they are, I'll call the mechanistic mode. In it, folks pretend that life is an equation that they alone have solved and then defend with slick evasion. They posture pure precision, crunching notions like they're numbers, all the while they're juggling books in vague seductive slumbers. Enchanted by their algebra, they see the x and y's as firm defined, not variables, no y's. Since they're so wise, lining up their deductive ducks all neatly in a row, they treat your challenges to them as evidence you're slow. They spout about the grandest things, freedom, truth, and kindness. Sure, they know just what they mean by revelatory blindness. Socrates was the first to note the mode's a social curse. Still, wondering what we really mean feels costlier and worse. At first, of course, to wonder removes our firm foundation. Yet struggling with semantics is how we'll save our nation.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. Socrates, and it just gives some historical context with somebody who was, persecuted by his own government for getting the youth to question things. And of course, he would go around sort of questioning everybody. That's why there's the idea of the Socratic method of just asking questions about everybody's worldview. So everybody started to get like unsure of themselves, and that sense of like insecurity, I think, made people lash out and not like the fact that he was making people feel uncomfortable, but perhaps that may be necessary, as this is suggesting, to save our nation, that we struggle with these balances and these semantics and these issues. Because if you're at this point in the seminar, I'm sure there's some things you're like, what? How do we navigate? Like we talked about it many times already. It's like, if you're confused, we don't blame you, right? We have to navigate this together. It's just we cannot forget about the different nuances because once you see them, you're like, wow, I can't unsee them. Right? It's just because we're just reflecting and seeing that side of ourselves or different parts of this reality we never considered. And we find out there's a lot behind it. So absolutely great to see, not just an explanation, but some poetry. And of course, putting it all on one slide, I kind of mix it up a little bit, but sounds good. So what about the authoritarian dimension? You see how there's like the authoritarian act, the formula, the follower. What's the dimension here? Well, Daniel Winterick, a psychologist, talks about this with research from Gordon Allport. His book, The Nature of Prejudice, a mid-century psychology, it included the traits of prejudice, which includes negative attitudes toward others, rigidity, which is closed-mindedness, lack of sense of humor, self-abnegation, right? Fatalism, obedience and admiration of authority, and low tolerance for uncertainty or ambiguity. And a quote is, individuals high in authoritarianism value social appearance, maintaining face and avoiding scams or being tricked out of money over their own physical safety. He also details how authoritarianism adopts parental characteristics, so affirming some of the things we talked about before. I find it interesting, fatalism is mentioned here. It says is also known as the belief in astrology and mysticism. I do have to say that there is some fixation regarding people in power, just as people below, that often attach to religious worldviews, right? There may be certain robes and certain rituals that are done on a mass scale that tend to go back in history quite far. And the question is why, right? Some people may even say like there's satanic rituals going on or certain statues that are just like out of place and not really supposed to be there. Whether it's with the Vatican or whether it's like with the certain ways structures are built. And some of them are still being used to this day. So there's a question as to why there's such a fixation on that among power systems and bloodlines. We can even see that some bloodlines of like royalty, for instance, in England and in the Vatican keep going down the line and they still exist to this day in the same bloodline. They haven't changed bloodlines. So it's very interesting to see.
Well, what I'd like to say is that fatalism for the ruling class is a way of encouraging propitiation. It's like, hey, give up. You don't have, there's not much you can do to change anything. And they encourage religions, which are deterministic. God has everything mapped out, and there's nothing you're going to do to change anything. But also, fatalism, going back to the personality of the authoritarian follower, fatalism is a great way to escape responsibility. And so when you assign cause to other than yourself, you assign it to the stars or to some numerology or things like that. That is where these things that may have some value, the cards, the astrology, mysticism, etc., may actually be models that align spiritual thought. It can be a spiritual practice. When they become fatalism, this is the way it is, and it supersedes the individual's own sense of empowerment and being able to cause effects into the world. And when you have a population like that, then authoritarianism reigns.
Mm.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's can sometimes be a naivety with certain things such as astrology or mysticism too. If somebody's getting into it, I mean, I see this often. I've heard this running joke of people again using astrology as fatalism, saying things like, "Oh, I'm going to have a horrible week because Mercury's in retrograde." It's like giving away their own power and authority because, again, like Scott said, of what the stars have to say, you abdicate your responsibility, which is dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like if we go back in history, we might see more of that. And I'm not entirely sure. I'm sure there's, I haven't lived back then, but looking at patterns, I can assume, looking at Samaria with the divine right to rule, that whole concept originates in like religion. And it's also interesting to see lack of sense of humor, because I mean, it is true that if we're perhaps more away from our emotional side of ourselves. Maybe we can't just take a joke and we take things perhaps too seriously, where we're like, "Whoa, what this person do?" And we're unable to see like, okay, you don't have to take it that way, right? That far, where then it brings us back to rigidity, which is like one of the main points here.
Mhm. Corey, that's a really good point in people that are seeking the truth or trying to find ways to discover freedom, is that once you start to dig into finding the truth, as they always say, it'll piss you off before it sets you free. And I think people can become very addicted to going down a lot of these rabbit holes. I myself have been guilty of this, and I've completely imbalanced myself as so far as just enjoying simple pleasures in life and having
Right.
that humor. And you see that play out in a lot of communities who are really seeking for truth and really doing the deeper work, because there's a lot of things in there that are very complicated, but
Yeah.
we forget to actually live our life and enjoy the good aspects that life has, which there are a lot of them as well. So
Right. Absolutely. And then, that goes to the last point here, low tolerance for uncertainty, having to research and figure it all out. And then once developing that ego inside of it, now we're not necessarily as open to other information. I did the research myself, so there it could be on both sides here,
yeah.
right? Very important to look at. And so going back to the idea of medicine to kind of bring things full circle, there can be toxic therapist leaders, right? So medicinal practitioners who are exhibiting perhaps authoritarian traits. Here we have Uriel Ubilov, if I'm saying his name correctly. Some leaders are like toxic therapists. By displaying both power and victimhood, they abuse people's fears and frustrations. People tend to project their pains onto their leaders' wounds and introject the leader's strength to seek revenge and redemption. Some Americans feel like victims, a sense that may be driven by narcissism and manipulation. Here's a quote. Politics, Laswell famously said, is about who gets what, when, how. And when Keith and Mick, we might add, you can't always get what you want, but you can make others suffer for it. And some leaders are all too happy to teach us how by both displaying strength, for which we adore them, and victimhood, with which we identify. Hence, political therapy, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, helps us understand this. Politics allows us to cast our personal resentments onto the public sphere. Hail Caesar, we say, hoping to heal ourselves. And so there's entitlement and victimization, two sides of the narcissistic coin. And I think that is perhaps a good example there as to why do people follow it. Political therapy, I like how it mentions that. But people may be seeking forms of therapy in a numerous amount of ways, and can be through perhaps their belief system.
Great slide.
And so if we're going to get a list of different things, expectations from authoritarians, right? If we're going to get really specific here, Eric Maciel, author of 50 plus books, tells us a bunch of different traits here. And you can go through them. I'm not going to read all of them, but you're going to see that a lot of these we have covered. Well, it might be important to see unclear rules, which it gives a name for quixotic, and then intrusiveness, right? Like messing with people's lives, people just like, I want to be left alone. Unacknowledged anxiety. We talk a lot about trauma and fear, which is very interesting. Shaming efforts, ridicule, derision. We see that a lot in the mere process of attaining power. Paranoia, enemy list. You say these are requirements. Religious fervor, we talked about. Superstitions. Well, again, Larkin Rose calls statism the most dangerous superstition. So what we're talking about as a whole. Anti-intellectualism and anti-rationalism, right? So perhaps you can say a perverted form of intellectualism, or a perverted form of emotionalism, or an imbalanced form, not necessarily, the two working together in a harmony. Hypocrisy, we talked about double standards before, some of the questions that start to raise some suspicion. Diminishment, demands and coercion, need for domination, right? Need, justification, prejudice, lack of conscience. There it is again. Lack of compassion. There we can go back to psychopathic tendencies. Conventionalism, right? Concerns with social status, physical appearance, we talked about. Submissiveness, preoccupation with sex and promiscuity. Interesting. Destructiveness, cynicism, exploitation. There's narcissism again, and then consistent authoritarianism, right? Because of course people may exhibit some of these things, but not on a repeated basis. And perhaps it's accidental. Maybe there's some things they don't see in themselves, or they're going through some hardship, but they're able to recognize that in themselves and get back into focus. Um, some of this we can say is falling into this mindset, unable to get ourselves out and see it.
And I want to point out the loyalty demands because I do think that that is a way that people, good people, generally are exploited. You know, people who value being faithful, being loyal, following through, right? You know, these are qualities that are good and that can be exploited through demands of loyalty.
Sure. Yes, and how, and then it's like the violence comes in, or it's the fear of violence, not even the violence itself that is carrying through this demand. And so he expands on this through a quote. I think it would be sensible to formally add authoritarian wounding to our current list of adverse childhood experiences. Now, we talked about before, people adding certain things to the DSM or certain diagnostics, and we talked about the problem with labeling as such, but it's always interesting to see that you have all these people looking at these mindsets and saying, hey, this is important to look at. He says the adverse childhood experience literature has focused on 10 adverse experiences that contribute to long-term psychological and emotional difficulties: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, and violence toward the mother, household substance abuse, household mental illness, parental separation or divorce, and the incarceration of a household member. But many other adverse childhood experiences likewise produce negative psychological and emotional consequences. I think we should consider adding authoritarian contact and wounding to the list of significant adverse childhood experiences.
And I agree with that. I want to make one clarification that this was a study done through Kaiser, this ACEs study, and what they identified is associated with ACEs is health, medical, physical health outcomes, detrimental health, chronic illness, not just psychological and emotional difficulties, but physical health problems. Yeah.
And can we simply become more aware of this and then start perhaps teaching our kids from an early on point of view to say, hey, don't suppress your conscience and don't just blindly follow, authority or the experts and other forms of authority, right? We talked about all the different forms. Can the individual have some sense of sovereignty over their own life, their health, and anything within that life? Because health is whole.
I think a big part of this ACE study too, Corey, to go beyond that, is not about just teaching the children, but actually the parents having the knowledge to not be emotionally neglectful to the kids in the first place. It's a little more upstream than that. It's that actually we're having children by parents who aren't in the best mental health themselves or have other issues that are actually impacting the child's ability to evolve in a healthy way, emotionally, mentally, or even physically. Seeing that Leslie said, there's physical impact and physical disease that can accumulate from having emotionally neglectful or an abusive childhood. So we could be making our kids sick. So we need to really start upstream with trying to bring the education to the parents.
Right. There we go. Well, let's go to Aldous Huxley and George Orwell. You may have heard of some of these folks talking about this. Like we mentioned, of course, Shakespeare and Julius Caesar, and how a lot of those shows that are seen for entertainment can actually tell us really deeply insightful, meaningful stories about our current world or our future potential world. And a lot of people compare our current world or where we may be going to the works of Orwell or Huxley. Huxley actually continued a lot of the works of Orwell, but not a lot of people are familiar with Huxley. So let's look at some of the differences here between the two, and you might see both provide really good insight. And so Here's a quote: "The real hopeless victims of mental illness are to be found among those who appear to be most normal. Many of them are normal because they are so well adjusted to our mode of existence, because their human voice has been silenced so early in their lives that they do not even struggle or suffer or develop symptoms as the neurotic does. They are normal not in what may be called the absolute sense of the word. They are normal only in relation to a profoundly abnormal society. Their perfect adjustment to that abnormal society is a measure of their mental sickness. These millions of abnormally normal people living without fuss in a society to which, if they were fully human beings, they ought not to be adjusted." That's a quote from Huxley talking about directly, mental illness and how we perceive it. And we talked about before this idea of the abnormal normality, right? There's a normality happening, but it's not normal at all in reality. And so, to compare and contrast Huxley and Orwell, members of the ruling class of 1984 used brutal force, torture, and harsh mind control to keep individuals in line, while the rulers in Brave New World by Aldous Huxley keep the citizens in line by drugs, hypnosis, genetic conditioning, and pleasurable distractions. Regarding censorship in 1984, the government tightly controls information to keep the population in line. But in Huxley's world, so much information is published that readers are easily distracted and overlook the information that is relevant. Wow. So can we see there's two ways that we can still fall into the same trap? So let's talk now about education, since we bring it up now quite a bit with children in former years and the mindsets that are developed over time. And I know that we're jumping from different things, but it's important to kind of get a sense of what we're looking at through some of the most important angles, right? We're talking about mental trickery, mental deception. We're talking about the upbringing of people. We're talking about the systems that are influencing that upbringing, whether it's medical or education in relation to politics. These all correlate with one another. So one without the other is sort of incomplete in many ways. Ivan Illich expands a lot on this through his works. He argues that traditional schooling systems create dependency, limit creativity, and reinforce authoritarian structures by promoting conformity and obedience. So, affirming a lot of our previous points, schools often damage students socially and psychologically by fostering a sense of inadequacy and dependence on formal education. He advocates for decentralized, deinstitutionalized, community-based education systems that emphasize self-directed learning, peer-to-peer teaching, and the use of technology to create learning webs. He promotes convivial tools rather than industrial tools. We talked about conviviality versus industriality and industrialization before. So he differentiates the two. Convivial tools are what enables individuals to meet their needs creatively and autonomously, fostering personal and communal well-being. So it's a very balanced perspective. Whereas industrial tools, they create dependency and limit individual freedom, reflecting authoritarian control. So the question is, which one are we using? Which one are we promoting the most here? His solution is to basically get rid of these government schools. So he talks about iatrogenesis, which is medical harm. Modern medicine, rather than improving health, often causes harm through what Illich terms iatrogenesis, which means doctor-caused illness. And so clinical iatrogenesis is direct harm caused by medical interventions. But notice again, just like we talked about with Orwell and Huxley, there could be hidden forms of this if we're not paying attention. There's social iatrogenesis, which is the medicalization of life, leading to dependency on healthcare systems. But then he also talks about cultural iatrogenesis, the undermining of traditional ways of dealing with suffering and death, eroding personal and community resilience. And the psychological impact of this is the loss of autonomy, right? Individuals become dependent on medical authorities, losing their ability to manage their own health. There's fear and anxiety, over reliance on medical systems, fosters that whole culture around it. There's control and surveillance, right? We talked about how that surveillance may even take place within the body through the machines. Institutional interest over personal well-being, and there's a power imbalance. People become the passive recipients of care, and it becomes very authoritarian as a whole. So, bringing together, again, the medicine with the education and the state, it's very important here that among all these lines, these authors, these different writers are all emphasizing autonomy and recognizing the authoritarian that is interfering with that autonomy in the individual. And so that concludes part 6 of Health Revealed. Thank you so much for joining us. If anybody has any last words, they want to say anything, feel free. But go to healthrevealed.org to learn a lot more. We have all the slides on there. If you want to read it for yourself, ever reflect, you could always go back in the seminar. Please tell us your journey, your experiences, your insights. We are open to all of it. And we thank you for joining us so far as we have been delving deeper and deeper into this mindset, statism and democide, and getting to this why are we in the world that we are in, and how are we getting out of it, and are we getting out of it in a way that's healthy or in a way that's actually more dangerous than the actual problem we're treating. Thank you for watching.
I'm not interested in a more benevolent ruler, right? Freedom is not whether I have permission to do something from the government. I am not free to do something just because the government allows me to do something. If there's ever a possibility then that the government could take away from me my right to do something, such as speak freely, which has happened repeatedly in American history, then I'm not free. I simply have a more benevolent ruler today than people in the past have had. But I'm not interested in benevolent tyrants. I want true freedom. True freedom is the ability to live and speak and act however you choose, as long as you are not engaging in violence and oppression of others, right? And so the key challenge to that today is the same challenge abolitionists had then, which is the threat of violence from the government. Because the government doesn't really want you to be free, and it doesn't really want you to be educated. It wants you to be smart enough to operate a forklift and to go and push a button when you vote. It does not want you to be smart enough to actually question the ideas that justify its existence. And it does not want you to have the freedom to live how you choose. It wants you to obey it. That's what people in power want. They want two things: your money and your obedience. Everything else doesn't matter to them, because those are the two things that keep them in power and keep them wealthy. And so the fundamental issue is the same one that the abolitionists faced in 1830, 1840, 1850, 1860, and beyond. That we are faced with an organization that is able to act with overwhelming violence, that it constantly indoctrinates us into its obedience, and that if we try to live freely, it will use that violence to oppress and control us. It will punish us, it will cage us, it will shackle us, it will kill us. This might be controversial to many people, but the fundamental difference between you and a slave is not very big, because the government still claims to be able to do the same to you. Right? If you think about what constitutes slavery, slavery is a person has no freedom. They cannot live how they choose. They cannot marry who they choose. They cannot smoke, eat, or drink what they choose. They cannot go where they choose. They cannot associate with who they choose, right? They do not control their property. They do not control their money. They do not control their work, right? And if they challenge the master uses violence and, torturous violence in most cases to terrorize that person back into obedience. All right, well, look at where we're at today. Many people have already experienced what happens when you dare to smoke or drink something that the government doesn't want you to, right? You cannot leave the country without permission. If you try to, they will imprison you. We've already seen that the government has no compunctions about locking you in your home for your own good, right? They'll claim, well, we're trying to keep you safe, so we're going to treat you like a prisoner, right? Like you're under house arrest, put you in your home, and if you walk outdoor, you could be fined or imprisoned. So the government claims the authority to control where you go, to claim the authority to who you talk to, right? This is the issue, not just with lockdowns, but like immigration. You have no right to decide who you want to interact with and associate with, because you cannot leave and they cannot come in. You can't buy or sell or trade with whoever you want. If you buy something you're not allowed to buy to, they'll put you in prison for it. If you don't pay your taxes, right? The government claims just because of its existence that is the authority to extract, extort, steal, however you want to put it, your money from you. And it gets to decide how much it takes and when it takes it, and you've got no authority over it. If you don't do it, they will put you in prison. If you resist being put in prison, they'll kill you. If you live in a place with property taxes, you don't have property, you have rent, right? If you don't pay your property tax, they'll fine you at first. But if you keep not paying your property tax, they will imprison you and take your property. They'll take your home. You don't own it anymore. Same thing with anything else. If I want to use my vehicle, if I want to use my car, I have to pay for the permission to do so, right? I can't just drive. I have to get permission from the state, and I have to do that regularly. So when you really start thinking about it, yes, the immediate violence in our lives is significantly less than someone on a plantation in 1850. But the ideas that justified slavery still exist. The ideas that made slavery possible are still real. And we live under them every day. We're subjected to them every day. That's what the state is. A plantation, which is the state in miniature. We live in a larger state where perhaps simply because there are so many of us, it can be harder to pinpoint us at any moment. But that's disappearing over time very quickly. The government can track you down at any moment, right? Edward Snowden revealed a decade ago that the government was spying on the public regularly, recording phone calls, text messages, emails without their knowledge and without their permission. So the government really is tracking us and keeping tabs on us. And I know that might sound crazy, but we have the actual NSA documents to prove it. Twitter was taking orders from Joe Biden to suppress news information that was critical of him and his son, and to promote news that made him look good, right? So these major organizations are in bed with those in power. And when you start thinking about it, we find ourselves in a very similar situation as the oppressed of many years have. And I think we often, because our shackles are softer, right? There's a scriptural term, flaxen cords. The devil will capture you with his flaxen cords. Flax being a very soft rope, like it's smooth, but it's strong and tight. It's a similar concept here, right? We're trapped, and because it feels nice, we don't recognize the ropes and the binds on us, on our hands, on our bodies, on our minds. But once you start to see them, they're everywhere. And I don't just mean that in a sense where, we all live in a society and society has expectations. Of course. If you look at early American history, you've got the Oneida community, you've got Hopedale, You've got the Mormons in Nauvoo, in Illinois, and Utah. The idea that we could, yeah, we all live part of society, but we could just gather together and make our own society and put our ideas into practice and see what works, right? You don't even have that freedom anymore. You can't join with a community like that anymore. You can't exercise even that limited amount of freedom. And so our lives have become easier because of technology, but our liberty is becoming more and more limited every day. And that's what we need freedom for, more now than ever before, just as much as they did in 1860.